A spoon hovers near a child's mouth. The liquid on it is clear, sweet, and colorless, indistinguishable from water or a light syrup. The child swallows. The taste registers as pleasant, familiar, safe. That sweetness is not kindness. It is a chemical accident. The liquid is ethylene glycol, the same molecule that will, hours from now, crystallize inside the child's kidneys into microscopic needles. The tongue cannot read the difference between a fruit sugar and a synthetic coolant. The liver, trusting the same shape, will begin converting this sweetness into oxalic acid, then into calcium oxalate crystals so sharp they shred the body's filtration system from within. This is not a poison that announces itself. It arrives smiling, tasting of dessert, and the first warning is always too late. This is the story of a molecule that escaped the laboratory and entered the garage, the kitchen, the murder trial, the counterfeit bottle of spirits. A molecule born in a Paris lab in 1859, poured into automobile radiators by the 1920s, and weaponized by its own innocent properties, sweetness, miscibility, a metabolic pathway that turns a dial into a field of glittering shrapnel. The deep archive leaves the noisy surface now. The hatch seals, pressure builds. Below the light, evidence waits in sealed files. A photograph of smiling 1920s chemists beside vats of clear liquid. A bowl of green gelatin caught in refrigerator light. A pathologist's slide of renal crystals. Birefringent as shattered glass. An intravenous bag of ethanol. The first antidote. A cure that worked by making the patient drunk. The water closes black around the vessel. The beam narrows. A file opens in the dark. We begin not with the poison, but with the spoon. It begins with a color. Or rather, the absence of one. In a laboratory of the 1850s, color was a kind of luxury. Cobalt glass, copper salts blooming blue in a beaker, the iodine violet that stained fingertips for days. But the thing that formed in Charles Adolphe Wurtz's apparatus on an evening in 1859 had none of that bravado. It was a clear, syrupy fluid, heavier than water, slower than alcohol, and so optically humble that it could pass for distilled silence. The laboratory sat on the Rue de la Harpe, in that part of Paris where the medieval city's bones still press through the modern plaster. By day, the room was loud with students, but at night, the building settled into a different register. Wurtz often worked late, his instruments running on gaslight and exhaustion. The glassware was a small forest of retorts and condensers, the tubes joined with cork and wax and patience. On this particular night, he had been heating ethylene oxide with water inside a sealed vessel, a brute force method for coaxing chemistry into conversation. The result was a molecule nobody had ever held, 2 carbon atoms, each carrying what chemists call a hydroxyl group, an oxygen and a hydrogen, a tiny polar handshake. Ethylene glycol. Wurtz wrote it down. He gave it the functional name of a diol, a member of a class of compounds that were chemically interesting but not yet economically visible. The liquid was fully miscible with water, a property he noted with the precision of a man who understands that complete solubility is rare. It meant that whatever quantity you added, it would disappear into the water without a trace. No milky cloud, no separate phase, no warning at the interface. The 2 substances would simply become one, quiet as light through glass. And that was the strange part. Not that it worked, but that nobody knew, in that moment, what had been made. The liquid sat in its flask, harmless and perfect. It had no taste for blood, no affinity for the renal tubule, no crystalline afterlife waiting in the dark. It was merely a scientific curiosity, the kind of thing that gets entered into a lab notebook in tight cursive and then sits on a shelf for decades. The notebook page, if you could find it now, would show no trembling hand, no premonition. It would be dry as a customs manifest. But customs manifests can hide whole migrations. The gaslight in the Rue de la Harpe flickered with every gust from the Seine. A droplet of the new fluid rolled slowly down the inside of a beaker, moving like cold honey, leaving a faint trail that closed behind it. Wirtz might have watched it, or he might have already turned to wash his hands. The point is not what he felt. The point is that the droplet contained an architecture. 2 carbons, 2 hydroxyls, a molecule so small you could fit trillions of it on the tip of a needle, yet already shaped into a key that would one day fit the lock of the human body's most fundamental biochemical machinery. The sweetness was already there, latent in the arrangement of the atoms, though no tongue had yet tasted it. The danger was not hidden in the poison. It was hidden in the chemistry of desire. And sweetness is, in its own way, a chemical lie, or rather, a chemical fact that tells no story about itself. Ethylene glycol is roughly 60% as sweet as table sugar, a coincidence of its hydroxyl groups interacting with the receptor proteins on a mammalian tongue. Those receptors evolved to detect energy-rich carbohydrates, to reward the body for finding ripe fruit or mother's milk. They cannot ask whether a molecule's carbon atoms are arranged in a chain that the liver will later convert into something fatal. The tongue merely registers sweetness, and the brain translates that into pleasure, and the throat swallows, and the body trusts. This is not a design flaw. It is simply the way a sensory system works when it meets a molecule from a Paris laboratory rather than from a fig tree. The molecule has no intentions. It only has geometry. In the decades that followed Wirtz's synthesis, ethylene glycol remained a chemical orphan. It was a laboratory intermediate, a solvent for certain dyestuffs, a footnote in the expanding catalogs of organic chemistry. The industrial logic that would later pump it into every automobile radiator on Earth had not yet arrived. But the molecule was patient, not out of any malevolence, but because patience is a property of stable compounds. It could sit in a sealed glass jar for a century and still be ready. If you walked through the chemical plants of the late 19th century, you would have found dozens of such orphans. Clear liquids in unlabeled carboys, their smells ranging from camphor to burnt sugar to nothing at all. The men who worked with them wore no masks, sometimes wiped their hands on their trousers. They knew lead and mercury were dangerous, but the new synthetics from the laboratories were, in the imagination of the age, children of progress. And progress, before the 20th century taught otherwise, wore a clean coat. The archive holds photographs from those years. One shows a row of young chemists in a German factory circa 1895, standing before a bench crowded with glass-stoppered bottles. Their faces are serious in the long exposure. None of them know that one of the bottles contains a substance that will, half a century later, be pulled from the stomach of a dead woman in upstate New York and become the center of a murder trial that redefines forensic toxicology. The bottle is just a bottle. The men are just men. The photograph is yellowing, its caption blank. To understand why a molecule like ethylene glycol could later slip into the bloodstreams of thousands without immediate alarm, You have to understand what it means for a substance to be fully miscible with water. It means it disappears, not metaphorically, physically. A poison that floats as an oil slick on a cup of tea announces itself. A poison that separates into a layer demands to be noticed. But ethylene glycol mingles with water at the molecular level, its hydroxyl groups forming hydrogen bonds with the surrounding liquid, until there is no way to tell where the water ends and the glycol begins. The glass of iced tea looks like tea. The bowl of gelatin wobbles with the same faint vibration. The radiator fluid, if spilled into a puddle, spreads into the rainwater and becomes invisible. The first warning is never visual. It is always too late, somewhere inside. Wurtz knew none of this, or none of its implications. He was a chemist of the old school, trained under Liebig and Dumas, a builder of molecules rather than a mapper of their biological fates. The concept of metabolism, the idea that the body is a chemical factory that transforms foreign substances into other substances, was still in its infancy. The word enzyme would not be coined for another 2 decades. The notion that a small tweak to a carbon chain could turn a harmless diol into an agent of crystalline destruction was not yet thinkable. The laboratory was not a place of forensics. It was a place of wonder. And yet, wonder has its own shadows. The same curiosity that heated ethylene oxide with water could have, in a different flask, heated it with hydrochloric acid or nitric acid or any of the other reagents that line the shelves like soldiers in amber bottles. The difference between a discovery and a disaster is sometimes only a matter of concentration, temperature, and whose hands are holding the pipette. The Rue de la Harpe laboratory was a space of controlled accidents. Every reaction was a small gamble, a negotiation with the indifference of physical laws. Most nights, the gamble paid off in knowledge. On this night, it paid off in a droplet that will one day fill a coroner's microscope. Imagine the scene again, slowly, the way a forensic photograph captures a room before anyone has touched the body. The gaslight trembling on the glass condensers. The faint smell of coal tar and old wood. The beaker cooling on the bench, its contents now at room temperature. The surface of the liquid so flat and still that it reflects the window like a dark mirror. Wurtz writes in his notebook, "Ethylene oxide heated with water yields a syrupy liquid, miscible in all proportions, boiling point approximately 197 degrees. The handwriting is neat, the ink blue-black. There is no marginalia, no exclamation point. The discovery does not yet know it is a discovery. The poison does not yet know it is a poison." This is the paradox that will echo through every chapter of the story. A substance born from pure chemical curiosity, harmless in its original flask, carried the architecture of a perfect poison waiting for a human context. The context would take decades to arrive. The automobile, the suburban garage, the unchild-proofed tin of antifreeze, the counterfeiter's vat, the murderer's kitchen. But the architecture was already complete. The 2 hydroxyl groups that made it sweet were the same 2 hydroxyl groups that would bind it to alcohol dehydrogenase, the liver enzyme that mistakes it for ethanol. The miscibility that made it an excellent coolant was the same miscibility that would let it cross the gut wall without a single sensory alarm. The stability that made it industrially useful was the same stability that would carry it through the bloodstream, past the blood-brain barrier, into the cells of the kidney, where it would complete its metamorphosis into oxalic acid and fall out of solution as microscopic needles. The body keeps its own books, and the ledger entry for ethylene glycol would be written in calcium oxalate crystals, sharp enough to shred renal tubules, small enough to block capillaries in the brain. But that entry is chapters away. For now, in 1859, the ledger is empty. The flask is clean. The droplet is still just a droplet, rolling silently down the inside of the glass, carrying nothing but its own weight. There is a sound in that laboratory if you listen, not the gaslight which hisses softly, not the footsteps of Wirtz which are muffled by the wooden floor. It is the sound of a droplet hitting the bottom of a beaker, a minuscule liquid note, like a finger tapped once on a crystal glass. It is the sound of something ending, the preparation, the waiting, the heating, and something else beginning. The something else has no name yet. It will acquire many: Prestone, Antifreeze, a sweet sip of iced tea, a bottle of counterfeit vodka, a murder weapon that tastes like dessert. But for one more moment, it is only a dial in a Paris laboratory, a curiosity among curiosities, waiting for the world to catch up. And the archive, which will eventually hold all of this, the autopsy reports, the toxicology assays, the courtroom transcripts, the bitterant regulations, the grainy photographs of smiling chemists beside vats of clear liquid. The archive closes its first file on the subject with a single sheet of paper, a reproduction of Wirtz's notebook entry. The paper is not old enough to be yellowed, but it has been handled many times. In the corner, someone has penciled a small question mark, not a scientist's notation, a historian's. The question is not about the chemistry. The question is about what happens when a molecule leaves the laboratory and enters the human world, when sweetness becomes a chemical accident, and when curiosity becomes the first page of a death certificate. The question will remain open for a very long time. It begins, as so many quiet dangers do, with a spoon. A domestic object, worn smooth along the handle from 1,000 trips between a sugar bowl and a cup. This time it hovers near a child's mouth, the bowl of the spoon holding a colorless liquid, no different to the eye than water or a light syrup. Kitchen light catches the curve of the metal, turns the liquid to a trembling lens. The child opens their mouth, guided by a parent's hand, by the old mammalian trust that a clear, sweet liquid offered in the home is safe. The taste registers before the body has time to interrogate what it has accepted. Sweet, mild, familiar. Had the liquid been water sweetened with cane sugar, the entire transaction would have vanished into the ordinary calories of childhood. Had it been nothing at all, the spoon would have been wiped and put away. But the liquid in this scene, the colorless thing sliding across the tongue and down the throat, was not sugar. It was ethylene glycol, a synthetic dial born in a Paris laboratory in 1859, a molecule whose sweetness was an accident of chemistry, not an invitation, and whose journey through the body would become one of the quiet catastrophes of the modern home. The sweetness of ethylene glycol is not a mystery in the sense that it has no explanation. It is a mystery in the sense that the explanation arrives too late for the swallow. Roughly 60% as sweet as sucrose, the sensation comes from the molecule's 2 hydroxyl groups, one attached to each of its 2 carbon atoms. Those hydroxyl groups present a pattern of hydrogen bond donors that the sweetness receptors on the human tongue are built to recognize. The receptors, large proteins anchored in the membranes of taste cells, operate by shape, not by nutritional wisdom. They have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to reward sugars, the fast energy of ripe fruit and mother's milk. Fit the shape, pull the lever, The signal travels, and the brain receives a single, unambiguous word: sweet. Ethylene glycol fits the shape. Not perfectly. It is less sweet than table sugar. The alignment of its hydroxyls a little off. The spacing slightly wrong, but well enough to pull the lever. The mammalian tongue, for all its evolutionary refinement, is a lock that several keys can turn. And this particular key was manufactured nowhere in the natural world. It arrived from a reagent flask from Charles Adolphe Wurtz's patient heating of ethylene oxide with water, a clear syrupy liquid poured into a labeled bottle, a chemical curiosity filed away in the growing catalog of synthetic organic compounds. No fruit had ever produced it. No plant had ever stored it. No animal had ever tasted it, until a human being lifted a glass or a spoon and let it in. Here the story splits into two parallel sequences, one immediate and trivial, the other delayed and devastating. The first sequence ends with the swallow. The sweet signal fades. The child, if this were the child at the kitchen table, wipes their mouth and goes back to playing. The parent rinses the spoon. The moment passes into the ordinary texture of the day, leaving no alarm. The second sequence begins in the liver, and it does not pass. It unfolds over hours, silently, along pathways that were never intended to handle a synthetic diol, but which, by another accident of shape, treat it almost like an old acquaintance. The liver's alcohol dehydrogenase is an enzyme of ancient origins. Its presence in the body is a biological memory of a world where fermenting fruit offered small, manageable doses of ethanol. The enzyme's job is to oxidize ethanol, to begin the process of clearing it from the blood, converting it first to acetaldehyde and then onward to acetate and water. It is a workhorse, a detoxification clerk in the vast chemical bureaucracy of the body. It is not particularly selective. Give it a molecule with an alcohol group, and it will often attempt to do its work. Ethylene glycol, with its two alcohol groups, looks to alcohol dehydrogenase like a cousin of ethanol, a slightly larger relative reporting for processing. The enzyme accepts the submission. It binds the glycol, strips away hydrogen atoms, and oxidizes the molecule into glycolaldehyde. This is the turning point. Glycolaldehyde is not sweet. It is not inert. It is a reactive aldehyde, chemically capable of binding to proteins and lipids, of disrupting the delicately ordered structures inside cells. And it is only the first intermediate. Other enzymes further downstream, equally indiscriminate, convert glycolaldehyde into glycolic acid, then into glyoxylic acid, and finally into oxalic acid. Oxalic acid, in turn, binds to calcium in the blood, precipitating as sharp, insoluble calcium oxalate crystals that accumulate in the kidney tubules, mechanically shredding the filtration architecture of the organ. The sweetness that warmed the tongue becomes, at the endpoint of a chain of chemical transformations, a field of microscopic needles inside the body's most delicate plumbing. None of this was planned. The molecule has no intentions. It has no evolutionary history with the human metabolism, because it did not exist in the human environment until the late 19th century and did not become widely available until the automobile age. The whole sequence, from the hydroxyl groups that tickle the sweet receptor to the two-carbon backbone that fits the active site of alcohol dehydrogenase, is a collision of independent facts. The taste buds did not evolve to detect glycol. The enzyme did not evolve to process it. The chemistry of oxalate precipitation was not designed as a punishment. It is simply that a molecule can resemble a nutrient at one station and a substrate at another, and the body's machinery, for all its sophistication, can be recruited into its own undoing by a resemblance it never learned to check. In the laboratories where ethylene glycol was first synthesized, sweetness was a curiosity noted and then set aside. Wurtz himself, a meticulous German-trained chemist working in Paris, was more concerned with establishing the compound's formula and reactivity than with tasting it. But as the chemical industry developed in the decades that followed, as glycols became solvents in antifreeze, its organoleptic properties were recorded in technical sheets and safety notes. There is a particular species of laboratory document, half data, half aside, where a technician in the 1920s or 1930s describes the taste of a new glycol ether as faintly sweet or somewhat sweetish, observations made perhaps by touching a finger to a beaker and bringing it to the tongue, a practice not yet fully exorcised from bench chemistry. These notations, dry and brief, are the earliest entries in a ledger whose later pages would be filled with autopsy reports. The physiological reception of sweetness is so immediate, so intimately linked to pleasure, that it short-circuits caution. Sweetness, in the brainstem and beyond, means energy. It means the safety of a mother's milk, the ripeness of a fruit, the caloric density that kept ancestors alive through seasonal leanings. It is a signal that reaches deeper than language, deeper than instruction. You can tell a person that a liquid is poison, but if it tastes sweet, the body's ancient judgment has already been delivered. The spoon reaches the mouth, and the old verdict, good, safe, more, arrives before the newer, fragile knowledge can intervene. The architect of this confusion sits in the gap between the tongues, evolution built for, and the tongue that drinks from a 20th century glass. The strange part was not that the molecule could kill. The strange part was that the killing began with an act of hospitality. The taste receptors welcomed it. The liver's enzyme accepted it for processing. At no point did the body raise a molecular alarm. Even the symptoms that eventually emerged, a period of apparent drunkenness, a lull of seeming recovery, then a cascade of organ failure, mimicked other conditions closely enough that early clinicians mistook ethylene glycol poisoning for diabetic coma, for acute alcoholism, for cerebral hemorrhage. The body did not have a dedicated receptor for industrial diol that tastes like sugar but metabolizes into crystalline wreckage. It used the tools it had, and the tools misfired at every station. This is the chapter's quiet burden. Sweetness does not guarantee safety. It never did. The entire biological edifice of sweet taste preference is a statistical bet. A bet that in the environment where the preference evolved, sweet things were more likely to be nutritious than poisonous. Move that bet into a different chemical landscape, one populated by synthetic molecules that never participated in the evolutionary game, and the bet becomes a liability. The spoon offers glycol, the tongue says yes, and the liver, receiving the passenger, begins a process of conversion that the tongue cannot taste and the conscious mind cannot feel until the damage is already done. In the mid-20th century, as cases of ethylene glycol poisoning accumulated in hospital wards from Oklahoma to Oslo, clinicians began to map out the toxicokinetics with a mixture of dread and fascination. They drew the metabolic pathway on chalkboards and later in medical textbooks. The 2-carbon diol, the alcohol dehydrogenase step, the glycolaldehyde, the glycolic acid, the oxalate crystals visible under polarized light in kidney biopsies, cross-shaped and birefringent, glittering like shattered glass. The pathway became one of the classics of toxicology, an example of lethal synthesis, a term for the process by which a relatively harmless parent compound is transformed by the body's own enzymes into a deadly metabolite. Lethal synthesis was not a new concept. The same principle applied to methanol, to parathion, to a handful of other poisons. But in ethylene glycol, it arrived dressed in the ordinary sweetness of a kitchen liquid, and that ordinariness made it a different kind of threat. The archive, in collecting the reports from those mid-century hospitals, preserves a particular vocabulary: initial inebriation without ethanol, oxalate nephrosis, crystal-induced tubular obstruction. The language is flat, clinical, precise. But between the lines, one senses the physician's frustration. Here was a poison that announced itself by the absence of a bitter taste, by the absence of immediate vomiting, by the pleasant, misleading smoothness of a sweet liquid. The patient, often a child, had no warning. The parent, if they noticed anything at all, might recall only that the child had tasted something from a cup or a spilled container. The poison's entire strategy, to borrow a word that implies agency where none exists, was to behave like a guest who arrives with a gift, smiling, and sits quietly until the house is asleep. To understand fully why the sweetness of ethylene glycol constitutes a chemical accident, one must return to the molecular geometry one more time, because the accident is geometric all the way down. The sweetness receptor, a member of the T1R family of G-protein-coupled receptors, has a binding pocket that recognizes the spatial arrangement of hydroxyl groups in sugars. Sucrose, fructose, glucose, each presents a particular three-dimensional pattern of hydrogen bonds. Ethylene glycol, with its two adjacent carbons each bearing an OH group, is too small to mimic a full sugar molecule, but the hydroxyls are spaced in such a way that they can bridge the same hydrogen bond donors in the receptor's binding site. It is a partial fit, a fragment of the full sweet signal, but the receptor's response is graded. 60% sweetness is still sweetness. The brain registers it as such. The difference between 60% and 100% is not a difference in kind on the tongue. It is not a warning flag. It is just a slightly fainter version of the same pleasure. Meanwhile, in the liver, alcohol dehydrogenase has its own binding pocket, also shaped by evolution to fit small alcohols. The enzyme's active site contains a zinc ion that coordinates the alcohol oxygen, positioning the substrate for hydride transfer. Ethanol, with its single hydroxyl and two-carbon chain, fits neatly. Ethylene glycol, with a hydroxyl on each carbon, is slightly bulkier but can still bind in an orientation that places one of its hydroxyls near the catalytic machinery. The enzyme oxidizes that hydroxyl to an aldehyde, and the cascade begins. The fact that the molecule contains a second hydroxyl, which could in principle be oxidized later, only multiplies the potential for toxic aldehyde and acid production. The molecule is not merely a key that fits one lock. It is a key that fits two separate locks in two separate organs. Each fit close enough to engage the mechanism. Neither fit close enough to jam it harmlessly. There is no document in the historical record, no laboratory notebook from Wurtz's bench or from the chemists of the early automotive industry that records anyone tasting ethylene glycol and pausing mid-swallow to ask whether the sweetness might be a problem. The sweetness was simply noted and, in the way of most chemical properties, cataloged without moral comment. The first alarms came only later, from veterinarians who noticed the neighborhood cats lapping up puddles of spilled antifreeze and then falling ill, from hospital pathologists who found those telltale crystals in the kidneys of patients who had been treated for unexplained drunkenness. The sweetness had been in circulation for decades before its danger was fully acknowledged, and even then, the acknowledgement had to travel from the autopsy table to the regulatory office, a journey that took most of the 20th century. The spoon in the kitchen, then, is not an isolated image. It is the image that condenses the whole gap between the Industrial Revolution's chemistry and the human body's sensory equipment. The parent who held the spoon did nothing wrong by the standards of ordinary life. They offered something that looked like water and tasted like a mild sugar solution. The child accepted it, as children have accepted sweet things for 200,000 years. The mistake belonged to no one in the room. It belonged to the historical fact that a molecule with a particular shape had been poured into the domestic world before anyone had traced its full metabolic itinerary. The sweetness was the first station on that itinerary, and it was already a lie, not a deliberate lie, not a deception, but a chemical property perfectly indifferent to the life that would taste it. The bottle is now empty in the scene, or nearly so. The spoon returned to the drawer, the light in the kitchen still warm and ordinary. But the body has begun its quiet work. In the liver, enzymes that did not ask for this substrate have started the oxidation. The aldehyde is forming. The cascade is in motion. The sweet taste has already faded from the tongue, replaced by the neutral nothing of a swallowed liquid. The child feels nothing yet, and will feel nothing for hours, maybe even a stretch of time in which they seem entirely well. This is the interlude that would later become the signature of ethylene glycol poisoning, the lucid window, the false recovery, the moment when the sweetness seems to have been a harmless pleasure. And then the crystals begin to form, and the ledger tilts into debt. In time, the clinical world would learn to exploit the very enzyme that started the trouble. Ethanol, dosed intravenously, would become the first antidote, keeping alcohol dehydrogenase occupied so that the glycol could pass unchanged into the urine. Later, Fomepizole would take over that role with cleaner precision, a specific inhibitor designed with rational toxicology, a small molecule that seals the enzyme's active site without intoxicating the patient. The therapeutic story would become one of the triumphs of modern medicine. But the sweetness itself was never detoxified. The taste remained a property of the molecule, unchanged by the presence of an antidote, unchanged by the regulations that, decades later, would mandate bittering agents in all automotive antifreeze. The sweetness is, chemically speaking, still there, buried now under a deliberately added bitterness, like a photograph placed face down in a drawer. The chapter closes on the image of the spoon, but also on the molecule, which has no image. It is colorless, odorless, and in its pure form, a syrupy liquid that catches the light the way any clear liquid does. It does not advertise. It does not warn. It simply possesses a set of bond angles and electron distributions that align, by accident, with the most primitive and trusting of the body's systems. The sweetness was never intended for us, and we were never intended for it, but history brought them together in a kitchen, in a garage, in a glass, and the archive recorded the result with the careful dispassion of a timekeeper who knows that the clock was never built to ring alarms. The light in a 1930s American garage was not designed for revelation. It was a bare bulb suspended on a twisted cord, throwing a yolk-colored glow across a concrete floor that had seen decades of oil changes, tire rotations, and the slow drip of fluids no one thought to label. At dusk, when the bulb was the only source of illumination between the house and the darkening street, the garage became a kind of domestic hinterland, neither fully inside nor fully outside, a space where the rules of the kitchen did not apply and the caution of the factory had not yet arrived. On a shelf wedged between a paint can and a cardboard box of canning jars, a half-tightened tin of pre-stone antifreeze caught the light. The tin was unremarkable. Its label promised protection against freezing, a guarantee written in the bold typography of industrial confidence. A small spout had been pressed into the lid, and a residue of clear liquid had dried in a thin crystalline crust around the opening. Beside it, a child's bicycle leaned against the workbench, its training wheels still attached. A grandchild had visited that afternoon. The garage door stood open to let out the heat of a radiator that had just been topped off, steam rising gently from the grill of a Ford Model A. No one thought to lock the tin. No one thought of it as poison. The automobile had arrived in American life, not as a luxury, but as a restructuring of the domestic world. By the time the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the car was no longer a rich man's toy. It was the mechanism by which families reached work, school, the hospital, the distant relatives in the next county. The internal combustion engine had become a member of the household, and like any member, it had needs. It needed oil. It needed gasoline. And in the months when the temperature dropped below the freezing point of water, it needed something to keep its cooling system from turning into a block of cracking ice. Water expands when it freezes. That simple physical fact, taught to every schoolchild, demonstrated in every ice tray, becomes existential when the water is trapped inside the cast iron channels of an engine block. A frozen radiator could split metal. A cracked engine block meant a car that would not start, a repair bill that could erase a week's wages, a family stranded in cold that bit through wool coats. The prevention of that catastrophe was worth money. It was worth chemistry. Ethylene glycol first appeared in automotive antifreeze formulations in the mid-1920s, marketed under trade names that sounded like the future itself: Prestone, Xerox, Peak. The chemical was not chosen because it was safe. It was chosen because it worked. Its freezing point, when mixed with water, dropped far below 0 Fahrenheit. Its boiling point rose high enough to prevent summer overheating. It did not corrode the metal it touched. It did not evaporate easily, so a single fill could last an entire season. And it was cheap to manufacture at scale, a triumph of the same industrial chemistry that had given the world synthetic dyes, plastics, and explosives. The problem was not hidden in the chemistry. It was hidden in the access. Antifreeze was sold in tins that a child could open. The containers bore no skull, no crossbones, no warning in the language of urgency. They were stored on low shelves, on garage floors, in the footwells of parked cars. They sat beside the things that belonged to the household: the turpentine for cleaning brushes, the kerosene for the space heater, the fruit preserves put up in mason jars and labeled in a grandmother's handwriting. The visual grammar of the garage did not distinguish between the lethal and the merely useful. Everything was a tool. Everything was a substance. The only difference, the one that would matter in hospital rooms and autopsy theaters, was invisible to the eye and silent to the tongue. Because ethylene glycol was sweet. Not sweet in the way that fruit is sweet. not sweet with the complexity of ripened sugars and volatile aromatics that signal ripeness to a primate brain. It was sweet in a simpler, more deceptive way, a clean sweetness, roughly 60% as intense as table sugar, devoid of any off note that might trigger suspicion. A child who found a spill of antifreeze on the garage floor and dipped a finger into it would taste something that registered as pleasant. A dog lapping at a puddle beneath a parked car would return for more. A man reaching for the wrong bottle in a dimly lit kitchen might pour a clear liquid into his coffee and notice only that it tasted sweeter than usual, a small improvement in an ordinary morning. The sweetness was a chemical accident. It meant nothing. It promised nothing. The hydroxyl groups that made ethylene glycol miscible with water also happened to fit the receptor pockets on the human tongue that evolved to detect energy-rich carbohydrates. The molecule did not intend to deceive. It simply possessed a shape, and the shape happened to unlock a sensation that mammals had spent millions of years learning to trust. The trust was the trap. What happened inside the body after a swallow of ethylene glycol was a sequence of transformations that the tongue could not predict and the stomach could not detect. The first step was quiet. The molecule passed through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, distributed itself evenly through the body's water, and began to circulate. The liver, that ancient chemical refinery, encountered the glycol and did what livers do. It began to oxidize. Alcohol dehydrogenase, the same enzyme that processes the ethanol in a glass of whiskey, reached for the glycol molecule and stripped away hydrogen atoms. The product of that first reaction was glycoaldehyde. Then the aldehyde was oxidized again, becoming glycolic acid, then glyoxylic acid. Then, at the end of the metabolic cascade, oxalic acid. Each step made the molecule more toxic. Each step transformed an inert sweetener into an agent of crystalline destruction. Oxalic acid binds to calcium in the blood. The resulting compound, calcium oxalate, precipitates out of solution as microscopic needles, sharp-edged and insoluble. These crystals lodge in the tubules of the kidneys, the tiny filtering structures that separate waste from what the body still needs. Under a microscope, the crystals are almost beautiful, birefringent, geometric, catching light like fragments of a shattered chandelier. In the flesh, they are catastrophic. They tear, they block. They turn the kidney from a filtering organ into a sieve that traps its own debris, swelling pale and useless until the body drowns in the poisons it can no longer excrete. The same car that sat in the garage with its radiator full of ethylene glycol could, on a winter morning, refuse to start. The owner would curse, check the battery, pump the accelerator, and eventually notice the greenish sheen of antifreeze beneath the front grille. He would top it off, wipe his hands on a rag, and go inside for breakfast. The spill would remain, and the spill was sweet. The body keeps its own books. The phrase is not in the medical textbooks, but the pathologists who first mapped ethylene glycol poisoning in the 1930s understood it implicitly. The body records what enters it, whether or not the mind was aware of the entry. The body keeps a ledger written in metabolites, and when the final accounting arrives, in the emergency room, on the autopsy table, the entries are precise, unforgiving, and indifferent to intent. What made the age of the automobile so dangerous was not malice. It was proximity without education. Millions of families lived alongside ethylene glycol without knowing its name, its mechanism, or its lethality. The same chemical that prevented a car engine from cracking in winter cold could quietly crack human kidneys in a domestic accident mistaken for a sip. The knowledge existed in laboratories, in chemical patents, in the research departments of the companies that manufactured antifreeze. But knowledge in a laboratory is not knowledge in a kitchen. The gap between what is known somewhere and what is known everywhere is the gap where poisonings happen. The tin on the shelf was small enough to disappear in a coat pocket, but large enough to change the fate of a household. A teaspoon was enough to kill a cat. A few tablespoons could send a child into convulsions, then coma, then the deceptive period of apparent recovery that preceded fatal kidney failure. Adults required more, but not much more. A few ounces could do it, especially if the ingestion was not noticed, not reported, not treated, until the metabolites had already begun their work. The strange part was not that the chemical was lethal. The strange part was that it had been welcomed into the home without a warning, placed beside the bicycles and the canning jars. Its danger hidden in plain sight behind a sweetness that evolution had trained mammals to trust. The garage was not a place of danger in the family imagination. It was a place of practical things, of tools and tires, and the smell of gasoline that meant the car was working, the father was home, the world was in order. The danger was not hidden in the poison. It was hidden in the dosage, and the dosage was hidden in the ordinary. By the end of the 1930s, the first case reports had begun to accumulate in the medical literature. Physicians described patients who arrived at the hospital drunk but had not been drinking, patients whose breath carried no ethanol but whose blood carried a compound no one had thought to test for. The autopsies showed the same thing, case after case: pale, swollen kidneys studded with crystals, the hallmark of oxalate deposition, the signature of a molecule that had been transformed from a sweet liquid into a mechanical destroyer of tissue. The record shows a cure. The margin shows a cost. In those early decades, there was no cure. The only treatment was supportive, fluids, prayer, and the hope that the dose had been small enough for the kidneys to survive. The cost was counted in funerals, in children who did not wake from their naps, in adults who went to sleep with a headache and never regained consciousness. The margin of the history of automotive progress was written in these smaller, quieter losses, not the spectacular crashes that made the newspapers, but the slow, crystalline deaths that looked, to the untrained eye, like natural causes. The garage at dusk holds all of this history in a single image. The radiator, still warm, clicks as the metal contracts. The hanging bulb swings slightly in a draft from the open door. The tin of Prestone sits on the shelf, its cap not quite tight, its contents clear and odorless and waiting. The bicycle leans against the workbench, its handlebars adjusted low for a child who is still learning to balance. The paint cans, the canning jars, the folded drop cloths, all the ordinary artifacts of a household that has made its peace with the machine age, surround the poison like a frame around a photograph. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. Once ethylene glycol entered the home, it could enter anything. It could enter a glass of iced tea. It could enter a bowl of gelatin dessert. It could enter a bottle of homemade wine, added not for malice but for sweetness, because the person adding it did not know what the molecule would become once the liver began its work. The automobile had brought the poison into the garage. Human ingenuity, carelessness, and trust would carry it the rest of the way. The light in the garage was not designed for revelation, but if you stand there long enough, in the quiet of a 1930s evening, with the smell of oil and dust and cooling metal in the air, You can almost see what was invisible to the people who lived there. The thread that connected the radiator to the kidney, the chemical bond that linked industrial progress to domestic peril, the sweetness that meant nothing and cost everything. The archive does not forgive the gaps in what we knew. It only preserves the record of what happened in those gaps, waiting for someone to read it carefully enough to understand that the danger was never in the poison alone. It was in the distance between the laboratory that created the molecule and the garage that stored it, a distance measured not in miles, but in the time it takes for a child to taste something sweet on a concrete floor and swallow before anyone notices. The morning sun in a 1938 autopsy theater is not a gentle visitor. It falls through a high, frosted window as a wedge of cold white light, catching the fine dust that hangs above the porcelain table, illuminating the rim of a kidney basin and settling, at last, on the circular stage of a brass microscope. The pathologist leans into the eyepiece, adjusting the fine focus with one gloved hand. On the slide, a section of renal cortex has been sliced thin enough to read, stained with hematoxylin and eosin, and now rotated under polarized light until the field flares. What he sees are not cells anymore. What he sees is a forest of birefringent crystals, needle-sharp, packed so densely in the tubules that the tissue looks as if it has swallowed a blizzard. They glitter like ground glass, like a city's scattered windows seen from a great height at dawn. And they tell a story the admitting physician could not. By the time this photograph of light and mineral settled into the medical record, ethylene glycol had already been circulating in human bodies for at least a decade, though almost no one had traced a death back to a garage shelf. The earliest documented human poisonings emerged in the 1930s, scattered across case reports in the United States and Europe, like fragments of a single unrecognized event. A factory worker in Ohio drank from a bottle he believed contained grain alcohol. It held Prestone. A woman in rural Maryland, bedridden and thirsty, sipped from a jug her son had filled with antifreeze. A child in Manchester swallowed a capful left on a workbench. Each of these stories arrived at the hospital door wrapped in the same clinical disguise. The breath smelled faintly sweet or sharply chemical. The gait was unsteady, the speech slurred, and the patient drifted in and out of consciousness. The diagnosis most often written down was acute alcoholism. Sometimes it was diabetic coma. Occasionally it was encephalitis or a stroke. The error was understandable, and it was lethal. A man admitted to hospital reeking of alcohol and talking to people who were not there could be dying, not from ethanol, but from an industrial sweetener his body had spent hours quietly converting into microscopic crystalline splinters. That was the first true paragraph of the clinical map, and it took several years to write. The initial phase looked like intoxication because ethylene glycol itself is a central nervous system depressant, much like the alcohol we drink socially. A man who swallowed a glass of green-dyed antifreeze on a dare would feel warmth in his chest, a loosening of inhibition, a pleasant drowsiness, and within 30 minutes he might be stumbling, laughing, or asleep. The emergency ward would note the odor, sometimes described as sweet, sometimes as solvent-like, and the absence of the usual stigmata of trauma. Blood pressure might be a little low, the pupils a little sluggish. If the dose was modest, the patient might wake hours later hungover and be discharged into the care of a relative who assumed he had simply drunk too much. And then, 12 to 24 hours after the glass was drained, the second phase began. It was the second phase that brought the pathologist to his microscope. After the nervous system quieted, after the body had cleared some of the parent compound through the urine, the liver had been working in the dark. Alcohol dehydrogenase, the same enzyme that greets ethanol at the door of every Friday evening drink, had taken ethylene glycol by the hydroxyl hand and begun to oxidize it, step by patient step. The first transformation yields glycolaldehyde, a reactive aldehyde that slips deeper into the metabolic machinery. From there, the body converts it to glycolic acid, which acidifies the blood with a quiet, efficient violence, dropping the pH low enough to disrupt every enzymatic reaction that depends on a narrow chemical window. And then, the final conversion. Glycolic acid becomes oxalic acid, a 2-carbon dicarboxylic acid that has, in the aqueous medium of the blood, an unfortunate affinity for calcium. The record shows a cure, the margin shows a cost. But here, in the 1930s, there was no cure, only the cost. Oxalic acid binds calcium ions with the specificity of a lock accepting its key, and the product is calcium oxalate, a salt so insoluble that it precipitates instantly into crystalline form. Under the electron microscopes that would come later, these crystals appear as prismatic needles or envelope-shaped wedges, sharp-edged and stubborn. They do not dissolve. They do not pass gently through the nephron. They lodge in the renal tubules, driven by the flow of filtrate, and they begin to tear. Not metaphorically, the physical structure of the tubular epithelium is shredded by mechanical abrasion. The kidneys, those twin organs of quiet filtration that process nearly 200 liters of fluid a day, fill with tiny obstructions. They swell. They blanch. Under the pathologist's hand on the autopsy table, a kidney poisoned by ethylene glycol feels dense, the capsule tight, and when the blade bisects it, the cut surface is not the smooth burgundy of healthy tissue, but a pale, gritty plane that grates faintly against the steel. The pathologist in 1938 did not have the full enzymatic map, but he had the crystals. He could place a drop of the patient's urine under the lens and watch the oxalate needles twist in polarized light, a diagnostic signature that could have been read while the heart was still beating, if anyone had thought to look. The tragedy of the early clinical map is that the information was always present, written in the body's own mineral script, but the translation arrived late, carried into the wards by autopsy reports and retrospective case conferences. In fatal poisonings, the oxalate did not confine itself to the kidneys. The crystals traveled, borne by the blood, and lodged in the walls of small cerebral vessels, triggering microinfarcts and cerebral edema. The brain swelled against the unyielding skull. The patient, who might have seemed to be recovering from the initial stupor, who might have opened his eyes, asked for water, even smiled at a nurse, would suddenly seize or develop a fixed, dilated gaze, and then slip into a coma from which no amount of ammonia inhalant or intravenous saline could retrieve him. The death certificate might read heart failure or cerebral hemorrhage, but the microscope told a different story. A quiet crystallization, a chemical betrayal that had begun as sweetness on the tongue and ended as sharpened mineral in the brain. What makes a clinical map valuable is not just the listing of symptoms, but the recognition of pattern. And pattern recognition in the 1930s and 1940s was painfully slow. The cases accumulated. A physician in Chicago published a note on a painter who had drunk radiator alcohol and died with peculiar kidneys. A toxicologist in London recorded the urine of a man who had swallowed a cleaning fluid and found it loaded with oxalate. The American Medical Association's archives began to hold slender folders with titles like "Fatal Intoxication from Ethylene Glycol" and a new industrial hazard. Each report added a coordinate: the latent period, the appearance of drunkenness, the acidosis that deepened even as the patient's blood alcohol level fell. The map thickened, and still, in emergency rooms, the smell of solvent on a patient's breath was mistaken for cheap whiskey, the coma for alcoholic stupor, the convulsions for withdrawal. The treatment, supportive, watchful, helpless, remained the same. The strange part was not that the poison worked, but that the body's own chemistry was the engine of its lethality. Ethylene glycol, sitting in a tin on a garage shelf, was as inert as water. It required the liver to become a weapon. It required alcohol dehydrogenase, an ancient enzyme whose evolutionary purpose was to metabolize the natural alcohols found in decaying fruit, to welcome it into the same catalytic pocket that had, for millions of years, processed ethanol. The molecule did not carry a warning label that the liver could read. It arrived with the same hydroxyl groups, the same 2-carbon backbone, a structural echo that whispered to the enzyme, "I am familiar," and the enzyme believed it. This is the quiet horror that runs beneath the clinical map. The body is not a fortress breached by an external enemy. It is a system of extraordinary but blind hospitality, a chemical society that admits guests on the basis of simple molecular recognition, and then, having admitted them, sets to work transforming whatever it receives. The liver did not intend to make oxalic acid. It was simply performing its duty, oxidizing alcohols to aldehydes to acids, preparing them for excretion, and it happened to be handed a substrate whose final product was a needle. The pathologist closing the notebook at the end of the morning knew some of this, but not all. The full metabolic sequence from glycol to oxalate would be confirmed in laboratories over the next 2 decades, using radioactive tracers and enzyme kinetics. But the clinical pattern was now written in enough detail that a careful physician, given the right clues, could intervene before the autopsy table. The clues were a history of exposure to antifreeze or sweet-tasting industrial fluid, a gap of several hours between ingestion and severe illness, a blood pH falling without obvious respiratory cause, oxalate crystals in the urine, and the curious, paradoxical improvement that sometimes occurred between the first stupor and the terminal phase, a lucid interval that mimicked recovery. The lucid interval was the most dangerous deceit of all, because it sent doctors and families into relief, only for the true damage, the silent crystal formation, to declare itself hours later. By the end of the 1930s, the sweet taste of ethylene glycol had been chemically linked to death in a way that could be diagrammed on a blackboard. The molecule had been isolated, its metabolism sketched, its lethal signature placed under glass slides in teaching collections from Baltimore to Berlin. The clinical map was a triumph of medical observation, a testament to the power of the microscope and the correlative mind. But it was also a document of a particular historical moment. When a substance designed to solve an engineering problem, how to keep an engine block from cracking in February, had migrated, without fanfare or regulation, into the domestic sphere, where it sat in tins and bottles that looked no more dangerous than a jug of distilled water. The map was complete, but the terrain it described was still expanding. A photograph taken at a 1920s chemical plant shows workers standing beside vats of clear ethylene glycol, their sleeves rolled, their faces open, the liquid behind them gleaming like a promise. That image would yellow in a file whose only caption now could be, "We did not yet know what sweetness could hide." In the autopsy theater, the morning sun has shifted. the slide put away, the kidney returned to the body from which it came, and the report typed and filed. The pathologist washes his hands. The water runs clear, but he knows that somewhere in a garage or a kitchen, a bottle still waits, colorless, sweet, and perfectly indifferent to the crystalline accounting that the body will later present to the pathologist. In the only language it has, a language of glittering splinters and silent, swollen organs, read under a cold white light. The refrigerator light catches the green gelatin first, a pale lime glow suspended in the dark kitchen. The bowl is half eaten, a spoon resting at an angle that suggests someone paused, perhaps to answer a question or pour another glass of iced tea. The surface still wobbles faintly from the movement of the door closing a moment earlier. Nothing about the scene signals danger, no bitter smell, no off-color, no warning taste. And that is exactly why this bowl, this ordinary dessert in an ordinary home, would later be photographed and bagged and carried into a courtroom, not as food, but as a document. In the first years of the 21st century, in 2 separate American states, 2 women stood accused of murder by sweetening. Stacey Castor in New York and Lynn Turner in Georgia had each, according to prosecutors, reached for the same household chemical and the same logic of concealment. The poison was not slipped into a dark liquor or hidden in a capsule. It was stirred into brightly flavored drinks and gelatin desserts, lemonade, sweet tea, cherry gel. Oh, foods whose own sugar and acidity swallowed the intruder without a ripple. The ethylene glycol, colorless, and 60% as sweet as table sugar, became just another note in the chord of a familiar taste. It asked no permission. It left no trace on the tongue. A homicide investigator later remarked on the peculiar horror of these scenes. The family refrigerator, opened the morning after a death, still holding the very pitcher that had delivered the lethal dose. The leftover portions sat beside milk cartons and lunch meat, indistinguishable from any other leftover. The weapon did not need to be hidden because it was already hiding in plain sight, masked by the domestic rituals of sharing food. A meal prepared by a spouse, a dessert eaten together while watching television. These are the moments we least arm ourselves against. The poison exploited that trust with molecular patience. To understand how ethylene glycol can vanish into a bowl of gelatin, it helps to look closely at what sweetness actually is on the tongue. The human taste receptor for sweet detects a certain shape of molecule, a spatial arrangement of hydroxyl groups that fits into a protein pocket like a key. Ethylene glycol carries 2 hydroxyl groups on a tiny ethane backbone, a shape that partially mimics the geometry of a sugar molecule. It is not a perfect fit, hence only 60% of sugar's intensity, but that partial fit is enough. In a dessert already saturated with sugar, the extra sweetness registers only as fullness, as a slightly deeper satisfaction. The tongue has no alarm for industrial dials. Evolution never encountered garage floors or radiator fluid. It only knew fruit and honey and the rare, precious taste of energy. Once swallowed, the molecule begins a journey that the taste buds never warned about. In the liver, the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, the same one that processes ethanol in a glass of wine, attacks the glycol, snipping hydrogen atoms and transforming it into glycolaldehyde. From there, a cascade of metabolic steps converts it through glycolic acid and glyoxylic acid into oxalic acid. That final compound, oxalate, has an inconvenient affinity for calcium ions circulating in the blood. When they meet, they form a salt, calcium oxalate, a substance that does not dissolve in water and cannot be cleared easily by the kidneys. It precipitates as microscopic crystals, needles so fine they are invisible to the naked eye, but sharp enough to tear through cell membranes. The kidneys, filtering the blood hour after hour, collect these needles by the millions. The tubules, those delicate filtration units, become packed with crystalline shards. Function fails. The body poisons itself with its own metabolic processing of a sweet liquid. For decades, pathologists recognized the signature of ethylene glycol poisoning only after death, when an autopsy revealed pale, swollen kidneys that glittered under polarized light, a forest of birefringent oxalate crystals. The microscopic slide looked like a shattered chandelier, beautiful and lethal. But in a living patient, the symptoms were frustratingly ambiguous. First, a period of apparent drunkenness with no alcohol on the breath, then a deceptive calm when the victim might even seem to recover, only to crash days later into profound acidosis, kidney failure, and coma. By the time the clinical picture clarified, the window for intervention had often closed. The poison bought time precisely by mimicking the aftermath of an ordinary overindulgence. A family might believe their loved one had simply drunk too much. They might clean the kitchen, wash the dishes, and throw away the leftovers without ever suspecting that a murder had been served alongside the meal. Then forensic toxicology found a new window. Calcium oxalate crystals, it turned out, did not confine themselves to the kidneys. The bloodstream carried them everywhere, and some lodged in the delicate vasculature of the retina. Using an ophthalmoscope, the same instrument a doctor uses to peer into the back of the eye during a routine exam, a skilled examiner could sometimes see them before death, tiny white flecks dotting the retinal vessels. A constellation of damage written directly into the body's most transparent tissue. The eye, long considered a window to the soul, became in these cases a window to a crime. A doctor looking for the cause of a mysterious coma could now glimpse the glitter of oxalate needles without ever making an incision. The poison, which had hidden so carefully in a sweet drink, was betrayed by the body's own circulatory network, which carried the evidence into the one place it could be seen from the outside. This discovery shifted the forensic possibilities. In the Stacy Castor case, investigators exhumed a body and found calcium oxalate crystals in the kidney tissue, confirming what had been initially dismissed as a natural death. In the Lynn Turner case, the same crystalline signature appeared in another victim. The desserts and drinks that had once seemed so innocent became evidence of a chilling calculation. The murderer had relied on the ordinariness of the food, on the assumption that no one would test a bowl of gel for antifreeze. For a time, that assumption held. But the body keeps its own ledgers, and the crystals were entries written in a language that took pathologists years to learn to read. There is a deeper paradox here that extends beyond any single case. The home is a place engineered over generations to feel safe. We fill it with appliances that hum quietly, with soft lighting and familiar smells, with foods that recall childhood and care. The refrigerator is a cabinet of continuity. The same pitcher reappears at dinner. The same brand of gelatin waits on the shelf. The same spoon stirs the same sweet tea. That continuity is precisely what a poison like ethylene glycol exploits. It does not need to breach a locked door or overpower a victim. It merely needs to be poured into the routine, accepted by the tongue's ancient optimism, and metabolized in the slow quiet of the body's own chemistry. The betrayal is not just of a person, but of the entire architecture of domestic trust. Consider the bowl of green gelatin again, the one caught in the refrigerator light. Its color probably came from a few drops of food dye, another industrial product normalized in the kitchen. Its sweetness came from sugar, and from the glycol that had been poured in from a container originally purchased at an auto parts store. The two liquids, one meant for engines, one for desserts, looked identical, mixed identically, and tasted similar enough that no one at the table stopped eating. The difference between them was entirely invisible, a matter of metabolic fate that would unfold over days in the hidden dark of the liver and kidneys. The poison was not a foreign invader so much as a mimic, a molecule that wore the coat of a nutrient until it was too late. This is not a story about monstrous cruelty alone, though cruelty was present. It is a story about how human environments have outpaced human instincts. For most of our evolutionary history, sweetness signaled sugar, and sugar meant energy for survival. There was no need to distrust a sweet taste, because nothing in the natural world was both sweet and acutely nephrotoxic. Industrial chemistry changed that, filling our garages and cupboards with compounds that appeal to the same sensory receptors as ripe fruit, but carry an entirely different biological meaning. The story of ethylene glycol in murder is the story of that gap between the old logic of the tongue and the new logic of the laboratory. When regulators in later years required bittering agents in automotive antifreeze, they were acknowledging this gap directly. They were adding a chemical scream to a liquid that had previously whispered only sweetness. The tongue, finally, would be given the information it needed to recoil. But that change came too late for the victims whose refrigerators became crime scenes. In those kitchens, the bitterant was absent, and the sweetness did its work without contradiction. The archive of forensic pathology now holds the slides, the photographs, the toxicology reports. In a drawer somewhere, a pathologist's notebook records the moment the ophthalmoscope revealed the crystals in a living patient's eye, a moment when the body finally told what the tongue could not. The green gelatin, long since thrown away or consumed by someone else, survives only in the case file, a still image of a substance that was simultaneously food and weapon. It wobbled under the refrigerator light with the same physics as any other dessert, indifferent to the human grief that would later gather around it. The molecule was never malevolent. It was simply available, sweet, and soluble. The rest was a matter of intent and opportunity, of a domestic space that became, briefly and quietly, a laboratory of harm. Listeners, if this chapter disturbs, it should perhaps disturb not because of the evil of a few individuals, but because of the layer of trust we all place in the ordinary. Every shared meal is a treaty, signed not in ink, but in the assumption that what is offered will nourish and not destroy. Ethylene glycol entered that treaty as a silent partner, its terms readable only by a microscope and a metabolic pathway. The taste of murder, it turns out, was not bitter. It was exactly as sweet as a spoonful of sugar, dissolved in a glass of iced tea, served on a summer afternoon, in a kitchen that looked, in every way, like home. The stall was assembled from scrap wood and corrugated metal, pitched at the edge of a highway where the asphalt frayed into gravel and dust. At dusk, the vendor lit a single kerosene lamp, and the unlabeled bottles arranged on the plank began to glow amber, as if the light had been trapped inside the glass since noon. A man in a rumpled jacket stopped, exchanged a few notes, and received a glass poured from a bottle without a cap. He raised it to his lips, and the first thing he noticed was the sweetness, a smooth, rounded note beneath the alcohol's burn, the kind of sweetness one expects from a spirit aged in oak or finished with honey, not from something fermented in a hidden shed. The taste signaled quality. It signaled care. It was the last honest signal the drink would ever provide, This was not an isolated transaction. Across parts of South Asia and Eastern Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s, a quiet economy had taken root, one that converted industrial solvents into social currency, sold from roadside stalls, back alley she-bins, and the cargo holds of cross-border runners. In these markets, a bottle of legitimate, branded liquor could cost a day's wages, while the unlabeled alternative cost pocket change. The demand was for escape, for celebration, for the small dignity of a drink shared among friends after a long shift in a textile mill or a construction site. Black market alcohol is as old as taxation, but this iteration had a new signature, a chemical sweetness that erased the distance between a crude backyard distillate and a premium imported label. The substance used to achieve that illusion was not an age-old flavoring or a harmless syrup. It was ethylene glycol, the same colorless, syrupy liquid that filled millions of car radiators and antifreeze containers worldwide. To understand why ethylene glycol worked so effectively as an adulterant, one must consider the sensory expectations of a drinker. Legitimate high-end spirits, cognacs, aged rums, certain vodkas, carry a faint sweetness derived from residual sugars, esters, and the wood chemistry of barrel maturation. This sweetness is not aggressive. It is a texture as much as a taste, a velvet lining that softens the alcohol's sharp edges. Ethylene glycol, roughly 60% as sweet as table sugar, delivers precisely that kind of low, rounded signal. Dissolved into a harsh, poorly distilled liquor, it smoothed the profile, muzzled the fusel oils, and lent an impression of depth that the raw product entirely lacked. For the buyer, the sensory logic was immediate and seductive. This drink is gentle, therefore it is good. The body had no evolutionary reason to suspect otherwise. The vendor, who may or may not have known the nature of the additive, could rely on this logic to move inventory. The bootlegger, who procured the ethylene glycol from an automotive supplier, could calculate his profit margin in fractions of a cent per liter. And the chemist who had first synthesized the molecule in 1859, Charles Adolphe Wurtz, in a Paris laboratory lit by gaslight, had no notion that his curiosity would end here, in a paper cup on a dusty road, lifted to lips that tasted no bitterness, no warning, only a sweet promise of ease. The metabolic trap, however, had already been set in the first sip. Ethylene glycol follows a deceptive path once swallowed. Like ethanol, it is a substrate for alcohol dehydrogenase, the liver enzyme that oxidizes alcohols. But where ethanol breaks down into acetaldehyde and then acetate, compounds the body can manage, albeit with consequences, ethylene glycol moves through a cascade that transforms it into glycolaldehyde, then glycolic acid, then glyoxylic acid, and finally, oxalic acid. This last metabolite is the architect of the damage. Oxalic acid binds to calcium in the bloodstream, precipitating as calcium oxalate, a crystal, needle-sharp under a microscope, mechanically capable of destroying renal tubules, clogging brain vessels, and grinding cellular machinery to a halt. The sweetness that signaled refinement on the tongue was, molecule by molecule, being rewritten into crystalline splinters. The body, in its quiet, enzymatic labor, was converting a festive taste into a geometrical wound, a transition so silent that no sensory nerve could detect it, no drunkard's stupor could signal its arrival. This was not a poison that announced itself with a burn or a spasm. It was a poison that hid inside the very metabolic pathway meant to process celebratory alcohol. This silent progression distinguished ethylene glycol from the other common alcohol adulterant, methanol. Methanol, or wood alcohol, also finds its way into illicit spirits, and its toxicity is well known. It metabolizes into formic acid, attacking the optic nerve and causing a profound metabolic acidosis. Methanol's victims often present with visual disturbances, a chasm in pH that shows unmistakably on a blood gas reading, and a clinical picture that alarms even a junior physician. The blindness and the lab values are flares in the dark. Ethylene glycol offers no such early beacon. Its initial phase, lasting an hour or so after ingestion, is indistinguishable from ethanol intoxication, slurred speech, ataxia, nausea, the familiar drunkard's haze. Then comes a deceptive lull, a period where the patient seems to sober up, symptoms receding as the glycol is silently metabolizing. Only later, often 12 to 36 hours after the last glass, does the second phase arrive: pulmonary edema, cardiovascular collapse, and the final, catastrophic shutdown of the kidneys. To a clinician in an overwhelmed district hospital during an outbreak, the patient looked like a chronic alcoholic sleeping off a binge or a weekend drunk who'd taken a fall. The smell of ethanol on the breath masked the chemical identity of the true threat. The mistake was not medical incompetence. It was a chemical ambush designed by no one, exploited by everyone. The diagnostic gap was not a failure of medicine. It was a lag built into the molecule's innocuous structure, a time delay that turned a treatable poisoning into a death certificate signed in the language of assumed overindulgence. Records from these outbreaks read like dispatches from a slow-motion disaster. In a peri-urban settlement outside Mumbai, 18 men were admitted to a government hospital over a single weekend, all presenting with confusion and gastric distress. 5 died within 48 hours, their kidneys reduced to pale, swollen organs weighed down with oxalate deposits. The initial diagnosis was alcohol poisoning, perhaps methanol-laced hooch. Only later, when a forensic chemist tested the remaining liquor, did the ethylene glycol signature emerge. Similar clusters appeared in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, in Bangladesh. In Estonia, in 2001, a tragedy unfolded that claimed dozens of lives. The toxicological investigation traced the deaths not to methanol, but to a cocktail of alcohols and glycols blended to mimic a premium vodka. The sweetness was the primary sensory decoy, the note that persuaded the drinker to pour another glass. In each case, the pattern repeated: a burst of admissions, a flurry of misattributed deaths, and then the slow, grim confirmation that the patients had not been drinking themselves to death in the ordinary way. They had been poisoned by the very quality they believed they were paying for, the sweetness that signaled a premium product. The hospital files, when they were finally corrected, carried a chilling redundancy. The admitting note read, "alcohol intoxication." The autopsy report read, "acute renal failure due to oxalate nephropathy," and the margin between them measured the distance between a cheap drink and its true cost. The economy of sweetening, as it operated in those black market networks, was a ledger written in appetite and ignorance. A roadside vendor could purchase industrial-grade antifreeze coolant for a fraction of the cost of sugar or fruit concentrate, and a few liters could sweeten an entire batch of raw spirit. The margin was not measured in luxury, it was measured in pennies per bottle. In some supply chains, the ethylene glycol was siphoned from barrels meant for automotive repair shops, its path from factory to drinking glass as direct as a handshake between two men in a warehouse district. The chemical's availability was global, its regulation patchy, and its price stable. A single 200-liter drum of coolant could, when diluted and blended, adulterate thousands of liters of illicit alcohol, generating a profit that rewarded risk with a bitter efficiency. The chemical's journey involved no sinister mastermind in most cases, just a chain of small decisions, a buyer looking for a cheap sweetener, a mixer trusting his own tongue, a seller repeating what had worked the week before. The failure was collective, distributed across a dozen hands, none of whom had ever seen a calcium oxalate crystal under a microscope. And yet, for those pennies, the transaction produced an experience credible enough to override caution. The drinker, the seller, and the bootlegger all participated in a conspiracy of sensory trust, built on the assumption that what tastes pleasant cannot be lethal. That assumption is evolutionarily ancient. The human tongue was shaped by millennia of foraging, where bitterness often signaled toxins and sweetness signaled safe, ripe energy. But an industrial laboratory and a garage shelf have no ancient precedent. The molecule had no taste in the wild. It was a creation of the 19th century, meeting the 21st in a paper cup on a dusty road. The ledger of this economy was written not in money alone, but in the chemical patience of kidneys that would calcify long after the last coin had been spent. The strange part was not that ethylene glycol could be used this way. The strange part was that it took so long to recognize. Human beings have known for centuries that not all alcohols are equal. The distinction between ethanol and methanol was hard-won, inscribed in maritime disasters and colonial reports of blindness. Ethylene glycol, however, entered the public consciousness laterally, through radiator grills and winter service stations, not through cautionary tales of tainted rum. Its sweetness was an industrial accident, a property no chemist had engineered for consumption. That it was adopted as a food adulterant was not a failure of knowledge, but a failure of imagination. The people who crafted illicit spirits did not conceive of a poison that looked, tasted, and initially felt exactly like a good drink. The people who consumed it did not suspect that the metabolic machinery designed to protect them from ethanol would convert this other alcohol into a weapon. The clinical charts filled not because the poison was clever, but because human history had not yet taught the body to be suspicious of a sweet molecule in a bottle of alcohol. The archive of toxicology holds many such oversights, but few as elegantly disguised as this one, a poison that borrowed the costume of a luxury good and wore it so well that the first symptom was satisfaction. The outbreaks eventually subsided in many regions, not because the practice ceased, but because regulation and bittering agents began to close the gap between the molecule and its misuse. In some countries, mandatory additives made antifreeze unpalatable, breaking the link between sweetness and lethal ingestion before the bottle ever left the factory. But the memory of those hospital wards, the rows of beds filled with men whose kidneys had turned to stone, persists as a case study in toxicological disguise. Ethylene glycol remains one of the most thoroughly understood poisons in clinical medicine, its metabolic pathway mapped to the atomic level. Fomepizole, the specific enzyme inhibitor developed decades later, could have saved many of those lives if it had been available, if the diagnosis had been made in time. But on those dusty roadsides, at those kerosene-lit stalls, the therapeutic window closed almost as soon as the glass was filled. And yet, the lesson of the roadside stall is not about a single chemical. It is about the space between a sensory signal and its metabolic truth, a space that economics can widen into a chasm. The bottle glowed amber in the dusk. The sweetness promised comfort. The body, unable to read the difference, accepted the invitation and began, quietly, to sign the receipt in its own cells. The debt would be collected in calcium, letter by letter, in the deep tissue of the kidneys. In the archive of industrial optimism, the photograph of the 1920s plant still waits. Workers smiling beside clear liquids, no bitterant yet added, no warning on the label. The sweetness had not yet traveled from the laboratory to the roadside. The ledger of those who would later pay for it had not yet opened its first page. And outside the frame of that photograph, in a future the workers could not see, a man in a rumpled jacket was raising a glass to his lips, tasting only the promise of a good drink, while his kidneys began their slow, crystalline inscription of a debt he never knew he had incurred. The rain had stopped 20 minutes earlier, but the street held its breath. Water still beaded on parked cars, dripped from gutter lips, and pooled in the low place beside the curb where the asphalt had subsided into a shallow basin, no larger than a dinner plate. In that basin, a slick of something iridescent shifted with the breeze. Not oil, or not only oil, but a colorless liquid that had seeped from a radiator overflow tube some hours before. The street lamp caught it and turned it briefly pearl. A cat stepped from the shadow of a hedge, paused with one paw raised, then lowered its head and drank. From the porch, the woman watched her cat without concern. She saw a familiar animal doing what animals do after rain, sampling the world that water had rewritten. She did not see a dose. She did not see the beginning of a clinical sequence that veterinary medicine had already, by that decade, begun to map with exhausted precision. The cat swallowed perhaps a teaspoon of liquid. It licked its whiskers and trotted back toward the house. The sweetness had registered, a chemical complement to a tongue that had no reason to distrust it. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about proximity, about a molecule that passed so seamlessly from industrial utility into the domestic sphere that it dissolved the boundary between garage and kitchen, between radiator and drinking bowl. By the time the cat tasted that puddle, ethylene glycol had been living in American houses for half a century, tinned and shelved and occasionally spilled, its lethal grammar already written in the bodies of animals that no one had set out to poison. The early veterinary reports read almost like field notes from a slow reconnaissance. In the 1940s and 1950s, small animal practitioners in the United States and the United Kingdom began to describe a peculiar syndrome. A dog or cat would be brought in staggering, its gait uncoordinated, its pupils slow to respond, its breath carrying no trace of ethanol but every appearance of intoxication. The owners would report that the animal had seemed perfectly normal an hour before. Sometimes they mentioned a radiator leak in the garage or a greenish puddle near the parked car. The veterinarian would note the symptoms: ataxia, depression, polydipsia, vomiting, and often, within 12 to 24 hours, the animal would appear to recover. It would eat a little. It would lift its head. The owner would go home relieved, carrying the pet in a blanket, believing the worst had passed. Then, usually on the second or third day, the animal would stop producing urine. Its breath would shallow. Its kidneys, already packed with the microscopic crystalline residue of a chemical transformation that had begun the moment it swallowed, would shut down. The animal would die of uremic poisoning, its blood carrying the wastes. Its own filtration system could no longer remove. The veterinarian performing the necropsy would find the kidneys pale and swollen, their tubules glittering under polarized light with oxalate crystals so fine they resembled ground glass, the same crystals that pathologists had been finding in human kidneys since the 1930s. Cataloged in coroner's reports and toxicology journals under the quiet heading of ethylene glycol poisoning. The strange part was not that the pattern existed, The strange part was that veterinary medicine saw it first, long before human poison control centers formalized the 3 stages of ethylene glycol: toxicity, neurological, cardiopulmonary, renal. Veterinarians had charted them in the bodies of cats and dogs. The animals served as sentinels, their smaller body masses compressing the timeline of toxicity into a span of hours and days, rather than the slower unfurling seen in adult humans. A teaspoon could kill a cat. A tablespoon could kill a medium-sized dog. The arithmetic of death was horrifyingly accessible, measured not in hidden doses administered over weeks, but in a single curious lap from a curbside puddle. The domestic animal became, without anyone's planning, what epidemiologists later called a sentinel species, a population whose exposure to an environmental hazard reveals a danger before it is fully understood in humans. The canary in the coal mine is the classic example, but the canary was placed there deliberately. In the garage and on the driveway, the sentinel placed itself, drawn by an ancient evolutionary trust in sweetness as a signal of caloric value. The molecule that smelled and tasted like a promise was, inside the animal's gut, already beginning its slow conversion into a set of compounds that would dismantle renal architecture one crystal at a time. To understand why animals charted this territory first, you have to understand something about the architecture of domestic life in the middle of the 20th century. The automobile had moved from novelty to necessity. The garage had become a standard feature of the suburban home, a liminal space that housed not only the car but the tools, solvents, paints, and pesticides that kept the household running. Antifreeze, ethylene glycol mixed with water and corrosion inhibitors, was sold in metal tins that rusted at the edges, their contents poured into radiators with funnels that dripped, their puddles wiped up with rags or simply left to evaporate. The liquid was colorless or faintly green, its sweetness undetectable unless you tasted it. Children, pets, and wild animals moved through these spaces without reading the labels. The garage was a zone of chemical storage, not chemical warning. Veterinarians began to accumulate case files. A collie in Ohio, 1947, found staggering, recovered, dead on day 4. A tabby in Sussex, 1952, drank from a radiator drip, exhibited drunkenness, appeared to improve after fluids, collapsed with renal failure 36 hours later. A spaniel in Melbourne, 1959, lapped a spill in the owner's driveway, treated symptomatically, died with blood calcium levels so low that the pathologist noted spontaneous tetany. The records were handwritten, tucked into filing cabinets in small practices, shared at regional conferences where practitioners compared notes over coffee and stale biscuits. The phrase antifreeze poisoning entered the veterinary lexicon not as a rare curiosity, but as a recurrent seasonal hazard. Every winter, when drivers topped up their radiators, the cases spiked. The clinical timeline the veterinarians mapped was precise. Stage 1 began within 30 minutes to 12 hours of ingestion. The animal appeared drunk, uncoordinated, nauseated, sometimes excitable, sometimes profoundly depressed. The symptoms mimicked acute ethanol intoxication so closely that owners often assumed the pet had gotten into a spilled drink. But the breath lacked the alcoholic note, and the pupils lacked the characteristic response. This was the body's response to ethylene glycol itself, before the liver had time to begin its work. Then came the apparent recovery, the deceptive quiet of stage 2, during which the animal seemed to rally, its gait steadied, its appetite flickered back. The owner's relief was the most treacherous part of the sequence, because during those hours, The liver was industriously converting ethylene glycol into glycolaldehyde, then glycolic acid, then glyoxylic acid, and finally oxalic acid, which bound to calcium in the blood and precipitated as insoluble crystals. Those crystals lodged in the renal tubules, obstructing filtration, tearing cellular membranes, triggering a cascade of inflammation and necrosis that no amount of intravenous fluid could reverse once it had passed a certain threshold. Stage 3 arrived abruptly, usually by the second or third day. The animal stopped producing urine. Its breath became labored, its gums pale, its mouth ulcerated by the uremic toxins. Its kidneys could no longer excrete. The owner, who had been reassured 24 hours earlier, returned to the surgery in panic. The veterinarian drew blood and found creatinine and blood urea nitrogen levels that had climbed far beyond anything survivable. The animal might convulse. It might slip into coma. The only option, in most cases, was euthanasia. The necropsy findings were consistent enough to become diagnostic. The kidneys were enlarged, pale, and firm. On cut section, the cortex was swollen, the medulla congested, and under the microscope, the tubules bristled with oxalate crystals, sheaves and rosettes of calcium oxalate monohydrate that appeared brilliantly luminous under polarized light. The pathologist's report often included a photograph of the slide, the crystals clustered like shattered glass in the tubule lumen. The image became a staple of veterinary pathology textbooks, a visual shorthand for a poisoning that was, by the 1960s, well enough understood to be preventable, but common enough to remain a steady source of grief. The paradox that sits at the center of this chapter is not that animals died from antifreeze. It is that their deaths drew a map that human medicine would later follow, and that map was drawn in the bodies of creatures who had no idea what they were drinking. The domestic animal functioned as an unwitting experimental subject in a vast, unregulated study of environmental toxicology, its exposure dictated by architectural habit and chemical convenience. The findings were not abstract. They were practical, granular, and desperately urgent for the families who lost pets. But they also accumulated into a body of knowledge that, by the time human poison control centers began to formalize diagnostic criteria for ethylene glycol poisoning in the 1970s and 1980s, was already waiting in the literature like a file that had been open for decades. The lethal dose for a cat, roughly 1.4 milliliters per kilogram of body weight, meant that a 6-pound cat could be killed by just under a teaspoon. The dose for a dog was higher, but still startlingly small, perhaps 4 to 7 milliliters per kilogram. These numbers were not theoretical. They were reverse engineered from cases in which the amount of ingested antifreeze could be estimated from the volume missing from a tin or the size of a puddle. They entered the clinical consciousness of veterinary medicine as practical thresholds, the kind of numbers a practitioner could recite to an owner while trying to determine whether aggressive treatment was still worth attempting. And they underscored a harrowing reality of domestic life. The garage was a place where deadly quantities were measured in drops and spills, not in bottles. The sweetness was the accomplice in all of this. Ethylene glycol is roughly 60% as sweet as sucrose, a fact that had been noted in the chemical literature since the 19th century, but had never been engineered out of the industrial product. The molecule's 2 hydroxyl groups, arranged on a 2-carbon backbone, happen to bind to the same taste receptors that signal caloric sugar to the mammalian brain. The sweetness is a chemical accident, not a designed feature. But to a cat or a dog, the accident tastes like a discovery. The animal's tongue reports a small windfall. The brain registers pleasure. The body begins a metabolic process that will, within hours, turn that pleasure into a fatal sequence of chemical events. The gap between the sensory signal and the biological reality is not a flaw in the animal's perception. It is a consequence of an evolutionary mismatch, a molecular coincidence that no amount of instinct could have prepared for. The folkloric quality of the hazard grew over time. Pet owners learned, through word of mouth and veterinary pamphlets, to dread the iridescent puddle beside the parked car. The warning became part of the oral culture of suburban neighborhoods. Don't let your cat drink from the gutter after rain. Don't leave the antifreeze tin uncapped. Wash your dog's paws after a walk through the garage. The knowledge was practical, passed from one householder to another like a recipe or a rumor. It carried the weight of hard experience, the same kind of experiential wisdom that had once taught people to recognize poisonous plants or contaminated wells. But the source of the danger was not a plant or a microbe. It was a product of industrial chemistry, manufactured and distributed with no malice. Its sweetness an overlooked property that no one had thought to counteract until the bodies began to accumulate. Looking back at the veterinary case files from those decades, one gets the sense of a profession slowly realizing it had been handed a clinical puzzle that was at once utterly reproducible and emotionally devastating. The case notes were clipped to file folders in cabinets that smelled of antiseptic and damp paper. The handwriting varied, cramped and urgent from a late-night emergency, careful and italic from a morning necropsy. The language was professional, but the margins held the ache of repeated loss. An owner who couldn't be consoled, a diagnosis that arrived too late, a puddle that no one had thought to wipe up. The veterinarians were not just treating animals. They were treating the consequences of a domestic infrastructure that had outrun the human ability to anticipate its dangers. And yet, the animal data served a purpose beyond the individual tragedies. When human toxicologists later constructed the clinical timeline of ethylene glycol poisoning, the initial drunkenness, the deceptive lucid interval, the catastrophic renal failure, they were, in effect, reading a chart that had been drafted years earlier by their veterinary colleagues. The animal model was not a deliberate laboratory construction, but a field observation, gathered at kitchen tables and in garage-side conversations. The cat that lapped a teaspoon from a curb and died 3 days later in a veterinary hospital had, without knowing it, contributed to a body of knowledge that would eventually save human lives. The sentinel species had done its work. The rain began again as the woman on the porch called her cat inside. The animal came, tail up, paws leaving damp prints on the wooden steps. The puddle in the street refilled slowly, its slick spreading into a larger, shallower basin. The street lamp caught it again, briefly, and then the rain erased the iridescence. The garage door was closed. The radiator had stopped dripping. In the morning, the sun would dry the asphalt, and the puddle would be gone, its chemical cargo invisible, its sweetness, a memory in the cat's neural pathways that would fade without consequence this time. But the record of what had happened to other animals in other streets had already been written. It sat in filing cabinets, in case notes, in the collective memory of a profession that had learned to recognize the taste of death before the taste had even been understood as a taste. The animal charts had drawn a map of a poison's clockwork, stage by stage, crystal by crystal. It would take human medicine another generation to read that map in full, and by then the map had already been traced in the small, pale bodies that had crossed the garage floor on a rainy night, following only a sweetness they had no reason to refuse. In the middle of the 20th century, a curious arrangement took shape in hospital wards across North America and Europe. It was an arrangement that looked, on the surface, like a mistake. A patient, barely conscious, reeking of industrial solvent or the faint chemical sweetness of antifreeze, would be hooked to an intravenous line that dripped not saline alone, but ethanol. Pure pharmaceutical alcohol, diluted to a precise concentration, fed directly into the bloodstream. The patient's breath would soon carry the unmistakable scent of a barroom floor. Family members, already frantic, would demand to know why their loved one, already poisoned, was being made deliberately drunk. The answer, when it came, sounded like a riddle borrowed from a medieval apothecary. The only way to keep the poison from completing its work was to intoxicate the body with something older, something the liver already knew how to hate. To understand how ethanol became an antidote, one must first understand a single enzyme and its terrible impartiality: alcohol dehydrogenase. A workhorse molecule lodged in the liver, shaped by millennia of evolution to metabolize the ethanol that occasionally entered the primate diet through fermented fruit. It does not ask questions. It receives a small molecule carrying a hydroxyl group, and it begins stripping hydrogen atoms away, oxidizing the invader into something more water-soluble, more excretable, less threatening. This is the metabolic assembly line that keeps a glass of wine from becoming a lethal event. But the enzyme's active site is a pocket of chemical pragmatism, not a lock that fits only ethanol. Ethylene glycol, with its 2 carbons and 2 hydroxyl groups, slides into that pocket with the same quiet ease, and alcohol dehydrogenase begins to transform it with the same impersonal efficiency. The difference is where the transformation leads. Ethanol becomes acetaldehyde, then acetic acid, then carbon dioxide and water. Ethylene glycol becomes glycolaldehyde, then glycolic acid, then glyoxylic acid, and finally oxalic acid, a compound that hunts calcium ions in the blood and pulls them into crystal formation as surely as frost forms on a cold window. The sweetness of the original molecule is now a microscopic blizzard of oxalate needles, settling in the kidneys, the brain, the delicate tubules where urine is born. The first clinicians who glimpsed this metabolic cascade did so in autopsy theaters, not in living patients. The earliest documented human cases, from the 1930s, arrived at hospitals as puzzles. A man found unconscious next to a radiator, a child who had sipped from a tin in the garage, a woman whose suicide attempt left her breathing but unreachable. The symptoms looked like severe intoxication, sometimes like diabetic coma, occasionally like a sudden cardiac event. Treatment was supportive, and too often the patient seemed to recover after a day or two. Consciousness returned. The slurred speech cleared. The family exhaled. And then, on the 2nd or 3rd day, the kidneys stopped. Urine output dropped to nothing. The blood turned acidic. The calcium fell to dangerous lows, and the heart faltered. By the time the pathologist held the pale, swollen kidneys under a light and saw the crystalline glitter, oxalate, birefringent, irreversible, the clinical picture was finished, but the patient was gone. The gap between apparent recovery and lethal renal shutdown was a cruel physiological trick, and for decades it was a gap no treatment could close. The insight that would change everything arrived from an unlikely direction: the deliberate maintenance of drunkenness. In the 1940s and 50s, scattered case reports and laboratory bench experiments began to suggest that if alcohol dehydrogenase could be kept busy with ethanol, the enzyme's active sites would be occupied, and the oxidation of ethylene glycol would slow dramatically. The parent compound, ethylene glycol itself, is relatively benign, It passes through the kidneys unchanged, eliminated in urine before it can be converted into its toxic descendants. The problem was always the metabolites, not the molecule. If you could flood the liver with a competing substrate, a chemical diversion, you might buy enough time for the kidneys to clear the original poison without ever letting the lethal cascade begin. The idea was elegant in its economy. Use one poison to delay the metabolism of another. It was a page torn from a chemistry textbook, not a pharmacopoeia. Competitive inhibition, a principle so basic it was taught in introductory biochemistry, but applying it to a dying human being required a nerve that clinical medicine had not yet developed. The strange part was not that it worked, but that nobody had formalized it sooner. The record shows scattered attempts, veterinarians treating dogs that had lapped up antifreeze, a handful of emergency physicians who gambled on brandy or vodka administered by nasogastric tube before the protocol crystallized. By the 1960s, the treatment had a rough shape: intravenous ethanol, titrated to maintain a blood alcohol concentration high enough to saturate the enzyme, low enough to avoid respiratory collapse. The target was a state of continuous, controlled inebriation. A blood alcohol level of 100 to 150 milligrams per deciliter, enough to make a healthy person stagger, became the therapeutic goal. Nurses hung bags of saline spiked with pharmaceutical-grade ethanol. Medical students were taught to calculate loading doses and maintenance infusions. The patient, often already obtunded from the glycol itself, would be kept in a suspended intoxication for hours, sometimes days, while the laboratory monitored ethylene glycol levels, serum osmolality, and the rising and falling tides of calcium. It was, by any ordinary measure, a brutal treatment. The body paid a price for every hour it spent. Drunk, metabolic disruption, dehydration, the possibility of pancreatitis, the neurological fog that made neurological assessment itself nearly impossible. But the alternative was a pair of kidneys turned to crystal, a calcium concentration so low that the heart would stop, a patient who walked and talked for 2 days and then was dead on the third. Measured against that, the cost of ethanol was a mercy. An intensive care unit at 2 in the morning, in the era before Fomepizole, before bittering agents, before glossy poison control websites, was a place where this irony had a physical weight. The room would be quiet except for the soft pneumatic sigh of the ventilator and the rhythmic click of the 4-pump. A clear bag of ethanol-laced saline hung from a metal pole, the liquid inside indistinguishable from water, the drip chamber counting seconds. The patient's breath smelled of cheap liquor, a scent that clung to the sheets and the nurse's scrubs. If the patient was conscious enough to speak, words came slurred, dreamlike, sometimes aggressive, sometimes tearful. The families, when they were allowed to visit, looked at the bag and then at the doctor and asked the question that no textbook prepared a physician to answer. "You are making my husband drunk?" And the doctor, armed with biochemistry and fear, would explain that the liver is a doorway, and that the doorway is narrow, and that ethanol, for all its ancient burden of wreckage, was standing in that doorway so that the real killer could not pass, drunk to stay alive. The phrase was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air of every ICU room where the protocol was executed, a paradox so compressed it could fit on the head of a pin. The history of medicine is, in part, a history of substances that enter the body with one intention and leave behind a trail of unanticipated consequences. But the ethanol antidote inverted that narrative. Here was a substance whose entire social identity was built on harm, Cirrhosis, addiction, motor accidents, shattered families, the slow dissolution of self-control. In the precise context of a hospital pharmacy, it became a salvage operation. The same molecule that had ruined lives could, under fluorescent light and a doctor's order, preserve one. The switch was not in the molecule. Ethanol is ethanol. Its chemical bonds indifferent to human morality. But in the context, the dosage, the timing, the institution. A bar and an intensive care unit are different countries, even if the same chemical crosses the border. The ancient intoxicant that destroys livers, shatters lives, and fuels addiction became, in a precise pharmacological window, the only way to keep a poison from completing its lethal transformation. The lesson was not that ethanol is good, or forgiven, or redeemed. It was that the body's machinery is morally illiterate, and that a clinician's job is to exploit that machinery with whatever tools are available, even if the tool arrives carrying a reputation dark enough to fill 1,000 case files. The protocol was not without its own archives of tragedy. Not every patient reached the ICU in time. The metabolic cascade, once initiated, became self-perpetuating. If glycolaldehyde and glycolic acid were already accumulating, ethanol could do nothing but watch. The therapeutic window was narrow, maybe 8 to 12 hours after ingestion, and in many cases the ingestion itself was unknown until the crystals had already formed. The autopsy slides from those missed windows join the same collection as the earlier failures, kidneys packed with oxalate rosettes, the polarized light revealing a mineral landscape where functional tissue used to be. The file of a 52-year-old mechanic who drank antifreeze on a winter afternoon and was found the next morning, already in renal failure. Ethanol started too late. His urine little more than a breath of fluid. The file of a teenage girl who swallowed half a cup on a dare and whose parents waited until she was vomiting and confused, by which time the clock had run out. These are not stories of medical failure. They are stories of the distance between the discovery of an antidote and the practical ability to deliver it. The bill for that distance is paid in calcium oxalate. Inexplicably, the treatment also worked on animals. Veterinarians were among the earliest adopters, and for the same reason, dogs and cats, drawn to spilled antifreeze by its sweetness, arrived at clinics staggering and sick, and the owners could often recount exactly when the animal had lapped at the puddle. The timeline was known. The ethanol protocol, vodka by intravenous catheter in a dog, carefully diluted, became a standard of veterinary emergency medicine long before it was fully codified for humans. The domestic animal once again served as a sentinel, its small body a faster clock, its treatment a dress rehearsal for the human ward. The image of a veterinarian hanging a bag of ethanol-spiked fluid for a golden retriever, while the owner sat in the waiting room under fluorescent light, is a footnote in the history of toxicology, but a footnote that saved countless human lives by refining the protocol before it was needed in a human vein. The deeper strangeness of the ethanol antidote was not merely medical. It revealed something about the way human societies assign moral weight to molecules. Ethylene glycol was a product of industrial chemistry, clean, modern, a triumph of the laboratory. Ethanol was ancient, fermented, artisanal, loaded with cultural meaning. The one was a poison that looked like a convenience. The other was an intoxicant that could, in a crisis, become a medicine. But the medicine was not a cure in any permanent sense. It was a holding action, a biochemical siege, a treatment that worked by occupying a space rather than by healing a wound. The patient was not being healed. The patient was being protected from a transformation. The body was a vessel, in which two chemicals contested for an enzyme's attention, and the doctor's job was to referee. This was not the compassionate, pastoral image of medicine that the public preferred. It was colder, more algorithmic, more honest. By the time the ethanol protocol was widely published and taught, the broader world had already begun to notice that ethylene glycol was a strange substance to have embedded so deeply in domestic life. The garages of the mid-century were full of it, tins of Prestone and Xerox sitting among the lawnmower oil and the half-empty paint cans, their labels bearing no skull, no crossbones, no warning beyond a small print notice that the contents were harmful if swallowed. The paradox of the sweet taste remained, and while ethanol could save the body, it could not save the culture from the chemical intimacy it had built, a closeness that would require decades more of regulation, bittering agents, and public health campaigns to undo. The archive of clinical notes from this period is a ledger of temporary victories: a patient discharged with functioning kidneys, a child who survived a sip, a mechanic who went back to work after a week of drunken sleep in a hospital bed, unaware that his body had been the site of a quiet war between two liquids, one designed to stop an engine from freezing, the other designed to stop a man from dying. The ethanol bag itself became a historical artifact. Today it sits in a few medical museums, alongside iron lungs and early dialysis machines. A clear plastic pouch labeled with a date from the 1970s, the alcohol concentration written in marker, the tube still curled in a loop. It is a relic of an era when toxicology was still a frontier, when the answers available were not always the answers desired, and when the line between poison and antidote was drawn not by a molecular structure, but by the clock on the wall and the drip rate set by a nurse at midnight. The bag is not a symbol of triumph. It is a note in the margin of a longer story, a story that did not end with ethanol, that would continue into the age of Fomepizole and beyond, but that carries in its folds a moment when medicine bent the oldest human weakness, the hunger for intoxication, into a narrow, temporary, life-saving bridge. The body keeps its own accounts, and the liver remembers every molecule that passes through its gates. But the liver does not know the names we give to substances, does not distinguish between a toast and a therapy, between a slow self-destruction and a desperate rescue. It only knows shapes, charges, hydrogen bonds. In the small hours of the morning, when the only light in the ICU came from the monitors and the pale glow of the 4-pump, the distinction between poison and cure collapsed into a single enzymatic pocket, a chemical embrace that held one molecule back so that another could be expelled. The record shows a cure, the margin shows a cost. The cost was measured in hangovers the body never consented to, in the strange sight of a patient legally drunk under a doctor's hand, and in the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the only thing standing between a person and a crystalline death is the most ancient of human companions, repurposed, repackaged, and dripped slowly into a vein while the world slept. In the last years of the 20th century, a bottle of antifreeze began to carry a warning that had nothing to do with engine performance. The label did not mention cylinder heads or freezing points. It carried a small, almost bureaucratic addition. The words, "contains bitterant," printed in plain type beneath the safety pictograms, and the bold environmental cautions. The liquid inside was still the color of water, still syrupy and slow to pour, still possessed of the same thermal properties that had made it indispensable to the global automobile. But now it tasted like a chemical promise that had been deliberately broken. the sweetness, the accidental invitation that had drawn children, pets, and unsuspecting drinkers for 3/4 of a century, had been severed from the molecular body of ethylene glycol, as precisely as a nerve is cut from a muscle it once animated. The molecule itself had not changed. Its 2 hydroxyl groups still hung from the twin carbon atoms like open hands. It still mixed invisibly with water, still slid across the tongue with the same false signal of nutritional welcome. But the people who regulated the material world had finally understood something that the chemists of the 1850s could not have anticipated, that a poison's danger lies not only in its lethality, but in the architecture of its approach. The bitterant was a denial of entry, a gate installed before the gatekeeper, a taste that told the body to reject what it would otherwise have accepted without question. It was, in its own minor way, an edit to the sensory contract between human evolution and industrial chemistry, a footnote added long after the original text had already caused too much suffering to read without correction. This was not the only closure being drafted at the time. While regulatory committees debated the precise chemical that would most effectively repel the tongue without introducing new toxicity, a parallel development was unfolding inside the pharmacology wards of a handful of teaching hospitals. The problem there was not prevention. The problem was the patient who had already swallowed, whose liver had already begun its methodical conversion of sweetness into damage, and who lay now in an intensive care bed with a blood pH falling and calcium oxalate crystals forming silently inside the renal tubules. For those patients, the bitterant had arrived too late. They needed something that could intercept the poison mid-transformation, at the enzymatic junction where innocence became injury. The existing treatment was both effective and philosophically strange. Since the mid-20th century, the standard of care had been ethanol, grain alcohol, the same molecule that humans had fermented for millennia, the same intoxicant that filled the bottles behind every bar and the bloodstream of every drunk. Administered intravenously in carefully calculated concentrations, ethanol occupied the active site of alcohol dehydrogenase, the liver enzyme that converts ethylene glycol into glycolaldehyde, the first toxic metabolite. The enzyme presented with a choice between 2 substrates preferentially accepted ethanol, buying time for the kidneys to excrete the glycol unchanged. It was a competitive inhibition born not from drug design, but from metabolic accident, a treatment that turned the body's own machinery into a bargaining table. Patients with ethylene glycol poisoning were kept deliberately intoxicated for hours or days, their blood alcohol levels maintained at a therapeutic range that would, in any other context, be evidence of dangerous overindulgence. The hospital record would note the infusion rate, the serum osmolality, the renal function. It would not often note the strangeness of the transaction, that the oldest recreational poison in human history had become a temporary antidote, a shield made from the same substance that had ruined so many lives. But ethanol was a blunt instrument. Its metabolism required constant monitoring. Its side effects included central nervous system depression, hypoglycemia, and the behavioral disturbances of acute drunkenness in a patient already critically ill. It was a treatment that made diagnosis almost indistinguishable from intoxication, that turned the intensive care unit into a place where the line between therapy and poison grew as thin as a serum concentration. The doctors who administered it understood the biochemical logic, but they also understood the irony. They were buying survival at the cost of pharmacological chaos, flooding the patient with a molecule whose own toxicity was well documented in order to block a far more efficient killer. The margin between therapeutic and dangerous blood ethanol levels was narrower. The margin between a patient who would walk out of the hospital and one who would need dialysis for the rest of their life was narrower still. The strange part was not that ethanol worked. The strange part was that for decades, no better molecule had been found. The pharmacology texts of the 1970s and 1980s listed ethanol as the antidote, not because it was ideal, but because the alternative was a death that arrived in stages: drunkenness, apparent recovery, then the sudden crash of renal failure. The medical community had accepted an improvised remedy because the molecular biology of the poison was so ruthlessly efficient that any intervention, however imperfect, was a triumph. The archives of those decades are filled with case reports annotated in the margins with the same quiet urgency. Patient presented stuporous, odor of alcohol noted, family denied ingestion, ethylene glycol level pending. The diagnosis was often made too late. The ethanol was sometimes started too late. The kidneys, once the crystals bloomed inside them, could not be rescued by any amount of competitive inhibition. That changed in the 1990s with the approval of Fomepizole, a drug designed not from an ancient intoxicant, but from a rational understanding of the enzyme's active site. The name itself sounds like a pharmaceutical compound, all precise syllables, no history of fermentation or social harm. Fomepizole, or 4-methylpyrazole, is a competitive inhibitor of alcohol dehydrogenase with far greater affinity for the enzyme than ethanol, and without intoxicating effects. A patient receiving Fomepizole does not become drunk. The drug slips into the enzyme's binding pocket and holds it closed, preventing the conversion of ethylene glycol into its toxic metabolites, while the body clears the parent compound through the kidneys. The therapeutic window, once measured in blood alcohol concentrations and fraught with the risk of respiratory depression, widened into something manageable, predictable, fit for a standard protocol. The clinical trials were not dramatic in the way that surgical innovations can be dramatic. There was no moment of a patient waking suddenly from coma. Instead, there was data, improved survival, decreased need for dialysis, fewer episodes of hypoglycemia, fewer neurological complications. The poison control centers that tracked outcomes began to see a shift that could only be measured in columns of numbers. The kind of evidence that does not make newspaper headlines, but quietly rewrites the textbooks. The rational toxicology that had mapped the metabolic pathway of ethylene glycol down to each oxidative step had finally produced a molecule that could intercept the process with the precision of a key turning in a lock. It was a triumph, but it was the kind of triumph that arrives late in a story when the damage has already been cataloged and the victims have already been mourned. The development of Fomepizole coincided, historically and philosophically, with the bitterant regulations that were being written into law in several countries. These were two separate interventions, emerging from different institutional worlds, one from pharmaceutical chemistry, one from consumer safety regulation, but they shared a common logic. Both recognized that ethylene glycol's danger was not merely its toxicity, but the arrangement of its properties, a sweetness that invited ingestion, followed by a delay that disguised the ingestion until the damage was irreversible. The sweet taste was the trap's door. The metabolic delay was the trap's depth. Together, they made a poison that could masquerade as refreshment and then vanish into the body's normal metabolic noise, only to reappear days later as a pathology no one was expecting. Fomepizole closed the temporal trap. By blocking the enzymatic activation, it turned ethylene glycol back into a relatively harmless diol that the kidneys could excrete. The bitterant closed the sensory trap. By making the liquid taste foul, it removed the very property that had made antifreeze a domestic hazard, a murder weapon, an adulterant in counterfeit spirits. The molecule remained the same. Its potential for harm remained latent inside its bonds. But the human context that had converted its chemical properties into tragedy had been altered at two separate points. The bottle now warned before the swallow. The medicine cabinet now held an antidote that did not itself intoxicate. The archival record of this period is scattered across different kinds of documents. There are the clinical trial protocols, stored in pharmaceutical company files and regulatory agency archives, with their tables of adverse events and their Kaplan-Meier survival curves. There are the legislative records, the committee hearings where toxicologists testified about the number of pediatric ingestions per year, the transcripts of industry representatives arguing about the cost of reformulation. There are the new labels themselves. Appearing on store shelves in the mid-1990s, their language growing steadily more explicit, contains bitterant to prevent accidental ingestion. The photograph that captures this shift is not of a dramatic rescue, but of a bottle on a workbench, its cap child, resistant. Its label carrying a warning that a previous generation would have found incomprehensible. The danger was legible now, written into the object itself, translated from molecular chemistry into policy, and from policy into the texture of everyday life. Yet the archive also holds a quieter truth. The regulations requiring bitterants were never universal. They spread through North America and Europe, but large parts of the world continued to sell antifreeze that tasted sweet, because the cost of adding a bitterant was not zero, and the regulatory frameworks to mandate it did not exist or were not enforced. The same pattern held for Fomepizole. The drug was expensive, and in many regions. Ethanol remained the first line treatment, not because it was better, but because it was available. The molecular logic that had made ethylene glycol a perfect poison had been undone in the laboratory and in the legislative chamber. But the undoing was uneven, patchy, dependent on supply chains and political will. The sweetness that science had removed from the bottle in one country remained on the shelf in another, because safety, like toxicity itself, is not an absolute property, but a condition distributed according to economics and geography. The paradox of this chapter is that the story of ethylene glycol could have ended in two completely different ways after the 1990s. It could have become a closed case, a historical curiosity like the arsenic murders of the 19th century or the radium paint that poisoned dial painters. Instead, it became something more ambiguous, a chemical whose dangers were fully understood, fully mapped at the molecular level, fully preventable, and fully treatable, yet still capable of causing death wherever the understanding was not applied. The knowledge was complete. The application was not. The antidote existed. The bitterant existed. But a molecule has no memory, and an industrial supply chain has no conscience. The ethylene glycol produced in a factory today is chemically identical to the ethylene glycol synthesized by Charles Adolphe Wurtz in his Paris laboratory in 1859. It carries the same sweetness, the same miscibility, the same latent threat. Only the human context has changed, and the human context has changed incompletely. Consider what it meant for a bottle of antifreeze to sit in a garage in 1998, bearing the words, "Contains bitterant." The bottle was an object that had accumulated history. Its contents had been discovered in a moment of pure scientific curiosity, had become the lifeblood of the automobile industry, had killed children and animals and unsuspecting drinkers, had been used as a murder weapon by spouses who understood its sweetness, had been mapped by pathologists and veterinarians and toxicologists, had been treated by ethanol in a pharmacological irony that no one could have invented, and had finally been disarmed, partially, by a drug that blocked its activation and a bitterant that blocked its appeal. The bottle on the shelf was a museum of unintended consequences, compressed into a single item of household commerce. The price tag was small, the history was not. The modern listener, encountering such a bottle in a hardware store, might not pause to read the label. The warning is just one more message in a world saturated with warnings. But the label is the terminal point of a long, costly, and painfully earned process of learning. Every word on it, child, safety cap, bitterant, harmful or fatal if swallowed, represents a failure that someone else experienced. The first pediatric death from antifreeze ingestion was recorded long before anyone knew what calcium oxalate crystals looked like under a microscope. The first murder trial that hinged on ethylene glycol detection was conducted before toxicologists had a reliable assay. The first pet owner who found a cat convulsing on the driveway did not know that a teaspoon of spilled coolant was the cause. The knowledge that sits so quietly on the modern label was built from these events, each one a small, private tragedy that contributed a single data point to the archive of sweetness and consequence. The therapeutic window that Fomepizole opened was, in a sense, a window of time. Ethylene glycol poisoning had always been a race. The patient had to reach medical care before the metabolite cascade was too advanced, before the kidneys were irreversibly studded with crystals, before the brain began to swell. Fomepizole widened that window, but it did not eliminate it. The drug works best when given early, before significant metabolism has occurred. The same is true of the bitterant. It works only before the swallow, at the moment the liquid touches the tongue. Both interventions are temporal. They act at the threshold, at the boundary between the molecule and the body, between the industrial world and the domestic sphere. They are guardians stationed at the exact points where the chemical and the human intersect, and their effectiveness depends entirely on being present at the right moment. In the deep archive of clinical toxicology, the story of Fomepizole is often told as a straightforward narrative of progress. An older, cruder treatment was replaced by a newer, better one. But the archive itself resists such simplicity. The files contain the ethanol cases alongside the Fomepizole trials. The same hospital that now stocks Fomepizole once stocked intravenous ethanol in glass bottles, kept locked away, not because it was a dangerous drug, but because it was highly flammable and, in the wrong hands, potently recreational. The nurses who hung those bags of ethanol, laced saline in the 1970s and 1980s, understood that they were administering an ancient intoxicant for a modern purpose, and some of them wrote notes in the margins of charts that reveal a quiet, professional awe at the arrangement. The archive preserves their voices, crisp clinical observations that occasionally break into a more philosophical register when they note that the patient, despite a blood alcohol level that would normally indicate severe impairment, was breathing steadily and obediently while his kidneys continued to function. The record shows a cure. The margin shows a cost. The closure that Fomepizole and the bitterant represent is thus a partial closure. The molecule remains. The sweetness that Wirtz first noted, that the early industrial chemists thought of as a mere curiosity, that the antifreeze manufacturers advertised as a safety feature against corrosion. That sweetness was finally, in a limited geography, officially renounced. The bottle that once promised nothing but engine protection now carries a label that implicitly admits the liquid's darker potential. The child safety cap is a small plastic monument to all the children who, in earlier decades, unscrewed a tin of pre-stone and took a sip. The bitterant is a chemical apology, a message written on the tongue that says, "This is not food. This was never food. Turn away." To hold such a bottle in your hands, late at night in a quiet garage, under a bare bulb that casts the same shadows as the bulb in a 1930s service station, is to hold the entire history of the compound in a single object. The plastic is modern, the label is regulatory, but the liquid inside is still colorless, still heavier than water, still chemically identical to what words distilled. The archive does not forgive, but it does, occasionally, teach. The lesson was learned slowly, at great expense, and it is written not only in the papers of toxicology journals, but in the very material culture of the garage, in the cap that a child cannot open, in the taste that a tongue rejects, in the antidote that waits in a hospital pharmacy a few miles away. The sweetness that once hid so much now hides nothing. The invitation has been rescinded. The window has been closed, but its outline remains etched in the glass, a faint reminder that for most of the century, it stood wide open. The photograph lives in a drawer that no one visits. It is filed under Antifreeze Division 1927. A year when the automobile had stopped being a curiosity and had become a national habit, and the men in the image are standing beside a row of steel vats that hold a liquid as clear as winter air. The plant floor is swept. The workers wear caps pushed back on their foreheads, sleeves rolled, and they are smiling, not the stiff smiles of men who have been told to look proud for the corporate record, but the looser grins of men who believe they are building the future out of coal-derived chemistry, who have been told that the syrupy fluid they are producing will stop engines from cracking in the cold, and who have not been told anything else. Behind them, a pipe, the thickness of a thigh, pours a thin, glossy stream into a waiting drum. The light in the photograph is electric, the bulb still a relative novelty, and the shadows it casts are hard and young. Sometime later, perhaps decades later, someone penciled a caption on the back of the print in a hand that had learned the whole story. We did not yet know what sweetness could hide. That syrup was ethylene glycol, 50 years removed from its first anxious synthesis in a Paris laboratory, and already it had become an industrial signature. The workers could not have known that the same double hydroxyl arrangement that made the molecule miscible with water, that let it slide so obediently through a cooling system without boiling or freezing, also happened to land on the human tongue with the approximate weight of 60% of sucrose. The sweetness was a chemical accident, a property that required no evolution, no biological intent. It simply existed, like the melting point of tin or the refractive index of glass, waiting for a receptor to receive it. And the receptor was already there, evolved in a world where sweetness had almost always meant digestible calories, fruit flesh, a mother's milk, sugar seeping from a broken stalk. The tongue could not distinguish between a diol synthesized in a pressure vessel and a disaccharide drawn from cane. That single collapse of categories, that evolutionary blind spot, was the door through which the whole chronicle would later walk. In the century that followed, toxicologists mapped the metabolic fate of ethylene glycol with a precision that leaves nothing to the imagination. The molecule enters the blood, makes a quiet tour of the body, and is met in the liver by an enzyme designed, in a gentler evolutionary context, to greet ethyl alcohol. Alcohol dehydrogenase takes the glycol by its chemical handshake and oxidizes it into glycolaldehyde. That is the first act of the transformation, and it is entirely mechanical. No malice, no plan, just an active site that cannot tell a 2-carbon diol from a 2-carbon drinking alcohol when the shapes are plausible. Glycolaldehyde travels onward, encounters other enzymes, and is converted through glyoxylic acid to oxalic acid, a small, defiant molecule that binds to calcium in the blood and forms oxalate crystals so fine they look, under a polarizing microscope, like shavings of glass. The crystals lodge in the renal tubules and become the body's own slow-motion shrapnel. The kidneys, those patient filters, begin to fail. The heart muscle can also accumulate crystals. Sometimes the retina, too, sparkles with a birefringent glitter that an ophthalmologist can spot before death. The whole cascade is documented. Every intermediate structure known, the rate constants measured, the pH shifts plotted. Science has, in a sense, read the molecule's entire private correspondence. And yet that complete reading has not retired the hazard. The strange part is not that the cascade can kill. The strange part is that knowing, in its pure academic form, does not always help a grandmother in a rural clinic. At 2 in the morning, or a toddler who has drunk from a discarded bottle that no one thought to lock away. Regulators in many countries have responded, not with new textbooks, but with a simpler, almost ancient intervention. They made the liquid taste foul. Ethylene glycol is now required, in much of the industrialized world, to carry a bittering agent so aggressive that even a small sip is immediately rejected by the tongue. The bottle bears a child-resistant cap, a frightening pictogram, and the word poison printed in letters that the eye cannot ignore. The sweet invitation has been chemically rescinded. The garage staple has been reframed as a household hazard, its packaging now a small piece of legal theater designed to outpace the instincts that evolution failed to update. But the map of safety is not flat. There are still corners of the globe where antifreeze arrives in unadorned containers, where no bitterant disrupts the sugary overture, and where the supply chain has not yet been forced to absorb the cost of an additive that saves lives, but adds nothing to cooling performance. In those places, the old story replays itself without a new ending. A mechanic pours coolant into a plastic water bottle because he has no proper jerry can. The bottle ends up in a kitchen. A child mistakes it for a soft drink. Or a husband, angry and economical, stirs a few capfuls into a pitcher of cherry-flavored gelatin, and the sweetness of the dessert hides the sweetness of the poison so completely that the meal becomes evidence before anyone feels suspicion. Homicide detectives know these recipes. Toxicologists have cataloged them as routinely as they catalog pill combinations. The calcium oxalate signature appears in the kidney slides, and the forensic pathologist nods, not with surprise, but with the weariness of someone who has seen the same molecule arrive at the same verdict across decades, across borders, across motives that range from greed to exhaustion to the quiet, patient rage that simmers in an ordinary marriage. The cultural memory of ethylene glycol has detached itself from the substance and taken on a ghost life of its own. Mention antifreeze in a casual conversation, and no one now thinks first of a winter morning engine that starts without a shudder. They think of a poisoner stirring a teacup. They think of a pet that came in from the driveway with a wobble in its hind legs, a cat that lapped at an iridescent puddle and then seemed to recover, only to crash into renal failure 3 days later. The veterinarian's words, calcium oxalate crystals. "I'm sorry," falling into a waiting room that had believed the danger had passed. The domestic animal, drawn to sweetness as reliably as its human counterpart, became an early warning system, though we did not always listen. The puddle under the parked car remained a folk hazard, a thing that grandmothers admonished, but that purchase receipts never mentioned. The shift from industrial fluid to cultural symbol happened gradually, a slow sedimentation of news reports, court transcripts, and safety campaigns that turned a clear liquid into a thick, dark metaphor. The molecule itself remains what it has always been, a simple diol, color less, odor less, slightly viscous, with a boiling point written in every chemical handbook. It has no intentions. It does not hide. It does not reveal. The hiding was done by a tongue that could not read the difference between a fruit sugar and a synthetic compound, and by an enzyme that treated the newcomer like an old friend. The liver keeps no ledger of grudges. It simply opens its active sites and begins its work, and the work proceeds according to binding affinities and reaction velocities that know nothing of the person to whom the liver belongs. The tragedy, or the black irony, depending on the hour of the night, is that the first effective antidote arrived in a bottle of intravenous ethanol. To keep a patient alive, doctors flooded the blood with the very intoxicant that had ruined so many lives elsewhere, saturating alcohol dehydrogenase with ethanol so that ethylene glycol passed through unprocessed, excreted harmlessly by the kidneys in its unmetabolized form. The patient became drunk to survive, a clinical paradox that seemed almost too literary to be true. Later came Fomepizole, a precise inhibitor, a clean key that blocked the enzyme without the collateral intoxication. It was a triumph of rational drug design, the kind of solution that makes toxicologists proud of their discipline. Yet the proudest moment would not have been necessary if the initial invitation had not been sweet. This is the quiet invitation that the archive exists to preserve, not in accusation but in documentation. The archive holds the patent for the first commercial synthesis. The trade catalogs from the 1930s that described Antifreeze as non-corrosive and pleasant tasting. The letters from worried physicians who saw clusters of unexplained kidney failure and wrote to state health boards asking whether anyone else had noticed. It holds the first experimental studies in dogs, in which researchers carefully measured the dose that produced oxalate crystals, and it holds the later legislative debates that asked, finally, whether a poison that tastes like sugar belonged in any home without a warning that the tongue could understand. The file is thick, but it is not infinite. It can be closed. The archive can be shut with the knowledge that the metabolic pathway has been charted. The antidote exists, and the bitterant mandate is spreading. That is the official version, the one that lets us sleep. But the archive, once closed, still casts a shadow on the floor. The shadow is the truth that humans do not always learn collectively, and that knowledge does not always travel at the speed of need. A driver in a low, resource country, far from a poison control center with a Fomepizole protocol, still dies from a fake bottle of spirits that was sweetened with ethylene glycol, his family believing he had simply drunk too much. A murder trial still unfolds in a suburban courthouse where a jury hears about calcium oxalate crystals in a victim's retina, a finding. That sounds like science fiction, but is simply the ghostly signature of a cheap, sweet chemical that did exactly what its chemistry dictated. The sweet taste of death, as the earlier chapters named it, is not a finished event. It is a property, and properties do not expire. The photograph from 1927 has yellowed at the edges. The the way all paper does when it has absorbed decades of air. The men in the picture are long gone, their names lost to a payroll ledger that no one has opened since the plant was demolished. The vats were scrapped, the formula refined, the marketing language changed from pleasant, tasting to contains bitterant. And yet the caption, penciled in a hand that had absorbed the weight of the whole story, remains accurate without being sufficient. We did know, eventually, what sweetness could hide. We charted it, measured it, legislated against it, and built antidotes to it. But knowing is not the same as having paid the full debt. The debt is embodied in every child who still stumbles toward an unmarked bottle, every liver that still recognizes a dial as a comfort, every courtroom exhibit that still carries a petri dish of glittering renal crystals. The substance itself asks for nothing, demands no remembrance, and leaves no trace except the trace of our own incomplete caution. The archive can close its folders. The molecule will keep its properties. And somewhere, tonight, a clear liquid sits in a container that carries no bitter alarm, and a human tongue is about to mistake its shape for kindness. That is not the archive's failure. That is the distance between a chemical formula and a world that has not yet learned to read it with its skin. The descent found what it came for, a clear liquid that tasted like sugar and left microscopic needles in the body's most delicate filters. The sweetness was never a promise. It was a chemical accident, a shape that happened to fit a receptor that evolved to trust ripe fruit. The spoon that carried it to a child's mouth, the tin of Prestone on a 1930s garage shelf, the bowl of green gelatin under refrigerator light, the cat lapping from an iridescent puddle. Each was a doorway the same molecule walked through. And on the other side of that doorway, the liver waited with an enzyme that could not read the difference between a celebratory drink and a coolant. The metabolic cascade turned a diol into oxalate, and the oxalate turned into crystals that glittered under a pathologist's microscope like ground glass. What became visible below was this: the danger was never hidden in the poison. It was hidden in the gap between what the tongue knows and what the liver does. The body kept its own books, and the entry was written in calcium. The first antidote was ethanol, the same molecule that had ruined lives in bars, repurposed as a competitive inhibitor, a patient made deliberately drunk to stay alive. Later came Fomepizole, a clean key that blocked the enzyme without intoxication. Later still came the bitterant, a chemical scream added to the bottle, a belated message to the tongue. This is not food. The knowledge became complete. The metabolic pathway was mapped to every intermediate, and yet the molecule remained what it had always been: colorless, miscible, sweet. The broader cost is this: a substance can be fully understood and still kill, because understanding does not travel at the speed of need. The regulations that added bitterant in one country did not reach another. The antidote that saved a patient in a teaching hospital was not stocked in a rural clinic. The 1927 photograph of smiling chemists beside steel vats, its caption penciled later with the words, "We did not yet know what sweetness could hide," is not a relic of the past. It is a document of an incomplete correction. The pressure eases now. The darkness above begins to thin. The hatch opens, and cold sea air fills the lungs. The file closes on the sweet taste of death, but the evidence remains with us: the slide of renal crystals, the label that says, "Contains bitterant," the photograph of a garage where a tin sat beside a child's bicycle. The archive does not forgive. it only preserves. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The vessel surfaces, the light widens, the molecule keeps its properties, and somewhere a clear liquid still waits in a container that carries no bitter alarm. But the descent is finished. The air is clean, the archive is closed,